The story begins when a woman was heard screaming from a musty house. She was screaming that if Zhou Wufeng was a man, he should beat her to death. At the same time, a man was sleeping peacefully on the bed. A disgusting liquid was pouring out of his mouth. The place where he lived was not a good place. There were only cans and bottles of booze, used cigarettes, and a pile of garbage. At the same time, the woman was on her knees and told to go to her and beat her until she died. Suddenly, the man's hand trembled. The man's face tensed. He was clearly feeling far from his best. All of a sudden, he woke up and immediately threw up on the bed. Out of surprise, the man started waving his head around as if he didn't know where he was. At the same time, another city filled with many skyscrapers was glowing from the outgoing light. The two men began congratulating the protagonist and offered to drink a toast in his honor. However, Zhou Wufeng, after barely taking a sip, let the shot glass out of his hands, and it shattered with a clatter. Zhou Wufeng grabbed his throat. The man looked like he was in incredible pain. Suddenly, the man fell unconscious. People began to gather around him and asked if he was okay. In a panic, they talked about calling an ambulance. Suddenly, the man opened his eyes. He started screaming furiously, instantly getting out of bed. After the man shouted, he tried to catch his breath. In contrast to the protagonist's mood, the room looked completely normal, with only the curtains swaying in the breeze. Zhou Wufeng looked out of the window and was very surprised at what he saw. Putting on his slippers, the man tried to get out of bed. Fastening his shirt, the man walked out of the room and tried to figure out where he was. And then it hit him. Memories began to surface in his eyes. However, along with the memories came incredible pain. He remembered that he had been married to Jiang Xiaoduo for 2 years. Both of his parents died when the equipment was misused. The man tried to get out of his shock, but he couldn't calm down so easily. His hands kept shaking. Suddenly, the man realized that those memories were not his own, and it was as if he had been reborn. Zhou Wufeng remained in shock for a while longer. He couldn't utter a single word. A woman's crying sound brought him out of this state. Zhou Wufeng obviously did not expect it, and turned to the source of the sound. There he saw a woman sitting on the floor next to a lot of broken bottles and a pile of alcohol. She was crying, either from unhappiness or despair, and called the protagonist a bastard. Seeing her, Zhou Wufeng said hello as if nothing had happened. The woman didn't expect it. Jiang Xiaoduo couldn't utter a word and merely looked at the protagonist as she continued to cry. Zhou Wufeng tried to turn around, for he was extremely embarrassed by the woman's revealing dress. Averting his eyes, Zhou Wufeng tried to apologize. Jiang Xiaoduo clearly did not expect this outcome of events and looked at the protagonist in surprise. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Zhou Wufeng turned around to the source of the sound. Walking over to her, he took hold of the doorknob and opened it. Yuna and little Zheng appeared outside the door. Zhou Wufeng greeted them politely. Zhou Wufeng noticed the bruise on her face and angrily asked who hit her. He also assumed that she had been hit by one Hu Han. That's when he remembered the scene of a man slapping Yuna's face while yelling that she was the reason his parents were dead. The same man told her to get away and stop talking nonsense. A high school girl with a sullen face asked why he was asking if he already knew the answer. She continued that they had run out of food. She said that little Zheng hadn't eaten for a few days and she came to ask for some money. Zhou Wufeng said to go in first. He asked Jiang Xiaoduo how much money and food they had left. She replied that they only had 5 yuan left, but they had 10 kilograms of rice and 2 kilograms of flour. Zhou Wufeng asked Jiang Xiaoduo to do him a favor. When he approached her, he asked her to give 5 yuan and 10 kilograms of rice to Yuna. He said they would have enough flour for a couple of meals, and he would think of a way to solve the problem. Jiang Xiaoduo held out the bill to the protagonist. Walking up to Yuna, Zhou Wufeng held out the bill and told her to take it. The girl was surprised at this outcome of events. Immediately after the girl took the bill, Zhou Wufeng turned around to leave. Everyone was surprised at this decision. Nervous, Jiang Xiaoduo asked where he was going. Opening the door, Zhou Wufeng said that he went to deal with Hu Han. As soon as Zhou Wufeng left the house, he heard joyful shouts outside. Someone was trying to sell metal products, scissors, and knives. Although the house Zhou Wufeng lived in was far from the tidiest, the street was the most ordinary. The noise and clamor were typical of this kind of place. After walking a bit more, Zhou Wufeng stopped in front of some unfamiliar house. He looked up and wondered. Walking up the stairs, Zhou Wufeng thought that this was really strange. The main character's parents had worked in the steel mill for almost 20 years, so how did they die from a machine malfunction? Leaning against the wall, Zhou Wufeng thought that being the director of the workshop, Hu Han could achieve fame and a good name if he gave consolation. The money would be paid by the factory anyway, and the man had no reason to reject the offer. Meanwhile, night had fallen. The moon was arched high in the sky. Some 2 men came to the door. One of them was biting his fist while the other pulled out his keys. After putting his keys in the keyhole, the man tried to open the door. However, suddenly both of them were startled by an unexpected sound. They abruptly turned around at the sound from behind them and furiously asked who it was. Zhou Wufeng happened to be there, who asked Hu Han with a calm smile if he had just returned. The second man tried to push the protagonist away and nearly knocked him to the floor. He furiously asked what his problem was. Hu Han approached the protagonist and asked why he was here. Putting his hands together, Zhou Wufeng said that he had come to make a request. Squinting his eyes, Hu Han asked how he could help. Clapping his hands, Zhou Wufeng said that it was about his parents. He said that it was really their fault for being careless with the car. He also apologized for his sister who kept giving him trouble. Hu Han did not expect such repentance from the protagonist and was greatly surprised. Suddenly, the man clapped his chest and started crying. Hu Han said that he was really so caring, and that he was really sad about what happened in the factory. He said that Yuna keeps blaming him for the death of the main character's parents, and isn't it absurd? Scratching his head, the protagonist agreed with the man. Zhou Wufeng said that he came to ask for comfort, because his family was in a difficult situation. Squinting his eyes, the man had already started to talk about the situation. However, Zhou Wufeng interrupted him and started shouting that if the factory did not agree to give him compensation, he would riot. He even said that since he would starve to death anyway, he would riot at his own pleasure. Hu Han tried to calm the protagonist down. He told him not to act rashly, because if he made a fuss in the factory, the bosses would still repress the workers, he might be detained, and he said to think about his family. Zhou Wufeng lost his temper and said he couldn't be bothered anymore. He gave an ultimatum. If the factory didn't give money, he would have to revolt. He also said that he would see if his parents had really made a mistake driving the machine. The man visibly tensed up. He said that Zhou Wufeng would not be able to get any money if his parents were guilty of negligently handling the car. However, he said not to worry. Hu Han said that he had been friends with the protagonist's parents for a long time and he would give him money instead of the factory. However, Zhou Wufeng immediately asked how much he would give, because if he gave very little, he would prefer to riot in the factory. Clapping the protagonist on the shoulder, the man said that the payment was usually 600 yuan, but he couldn't give more than 500 since he needed the money too. He told the protagonist to wait a while and let him get the money. While Zhou Wufeng leaned against the door arch, Hu Han started rummaging through a pile of papers looking for money. Handing the protagonist the money, the man said it was for him. It was still night outside. A black cat ran across the road. Walking out of the house, Zhou Wufeng said that he would definitely make the man pay for his sins. That's when he saw a Chinese candy vendor walking by. Walking up to him, Zhou Wufeng saw that the man was selling 6 pieces of such. However, it wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng went home. Zhang Xiaoduo heard someone opening the door and turned around to the source of the sound. There stood Zhou Wufeng, who was wishing her happy birthday with a joyful smile. The woman clearly hadn't expected such a move on his part, was greatly surprised. Zhou Wufeng said with a soft smile that he was sorry that he could only give this. He was still making excuses that when he left Hu Han's house, it was already quite late. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng held out 2 servings of sweets. Zhang Xiaoduo decided to try one stick. After tasting a piece, Zhang Xiaoduo's eyes seemed to light up. She turned to the protagonist and asked if he wanted to take a bite. Zhou Wufeng said that he had already eaten, and it was all for her. Smiling softly, the man thought that after he left, he hoped that the real Zhou Wufeng would treat the woman well. Looking at his watch, Zhou Wufeng realized that it was already later than 10 o'clock. Zhang Xiaoduo called out and asked if Zhou Wufeng was going to bed. It was late at night. The moon was shining in the wide sky. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng and Zhang Xiaoduo went to bed. Even though Zhou Wufeng was spinning on the edge of the bed, he still casually touched his wife's breast with his hand. Zhou Wufeng blushed and repeated to himself that she was someone else's wife. He still couldn't fall asleep. Soon it was morning. The rooster crowed at dawn. Along with him, Zhou Wufeng literally jumped out of bed. With bags under his eyes, Zhou Wufeng thought that someday he would kill this Aunt Wang's rooster. Quite soon, Zhang Xiaoduo walked out of the bedroom. She was surprised to find a pleasant odor spreading through the apartment. Placing a couple of chopsticks and another plate on the table, the protagonist turned to his wife. She said it was longevity noodles and he had made it to celebrate her birthday yesterday. He said to eat the egg first. He went on to say that he borrowed it from Aunt Wang, but she doesn't know about it. The woman was extremely surprised at such a bad act on the part of the protagonist and asked how he could steal. Zhou Wufeng said that he really just borrowed it and promised that he would return it. Here he placed a stack of bills on the table. The woman was surprised at such a huge amount of money. Zhang Xiaoduo, thinking about how Zhou Wufeng dared to steal the egg, asked where he got so much money from, and if he stole it too. Waving the bills, Zhou Wufeng said not to worry because it was compensation for mom and dad. However, the woman did not believe this explanation. Zhang Xiaoduo started asking, didn't the factory say it was his parents' mistake? She thought it was illogical that they compensated for it. Zhou Wufeng revealed that he got it from Hu Han. He thinks he must have been afraid that Zhou Wufeng would cause a riot in the factory, so he gave the money instead. The woman was surprised by this action of the protagonist and asked what his plan was. Standing up from the table, Zhou Wufeng said that he will try to gather evidence. He thinks that Hu Han can hide everything from him, and since Zhou Wufeng took the money, he must have let his guard down. The man said that with that money, they wouldn't have to worry about food for a while. After the couple finished their food, Zhou Wufeng collected the plates. The woman looked at him in surprise. She remembered that her husband had never done this before and asked her if he was really Zhou Wufeng. Zhou Wufeng flinched at such a question. Coughing, Zhou Wufeng turned to the woman and asked what she was talking about since it was really him. Trying to change the subject, he started talking about money. He said that she would take 200 yuan and the man himself would take 100, also giving 100 yuan to Yuna. He also said that the remaining 100 would be exchanged for food and asked if that was okay. Zhang Xiaoduo agreed with this division. After that, Zhou Wufeng said that he would go look for Yuna. As soon as Zhou Wufeng came out of the house, he saw a woman feeding the birds. Aunt Wang asked if he had seen her eggs. Zhou Wufeng passed by her and said that yes, he had seen and borrowed one while she was away. Aunt Wang raised her head with displeasure on her face. She became furious and furiously asked how he could have borrowed it if she didn't agree, and if he didn't think he was being inconsiderate. As she spoke, Zhou Wufeng immediately took out a single bill. With a calm face, he held it out to the woman and said, "Here are the 2 yuan he will pay for the eggs." At the same moment, a woman with a happy face told me not to hesitate to take it next time. The man continued on his way to the children. However, behind one of the pillars stood Nike Liu. The man was holding some grass in his mouth, and he asked where Zhou Wufeng was going. Zhou Wufeng said hello to his buddy. With grass sticking out of his mouth, the man said that there would be a gambling match with Chen Chora tonight. He said that they could team up and win his money. Zhou Wufeng averted his eyes, trying to remember the identity of that Chen Chora. He remembered that his father was the former head of the Linshui steel factory and was currently working there. Continuing his conversation, Nike said he would come to his place tonight and asked if Zhang Xiaoduo would be with them. After averting his eyes, Zhou Wufeng thought that he would really need to meet with Guoda. However, he decided to do things his own way. Waving his hand, he said he would go to Nike's house instead while he was out. While Zhou Wufeng was pacing, Nike Liu thought that Zhou Wufeng was a real coward. And sighing, he thought about how he had managed to marry such a beautiful woman. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng approached Yuna and little Jen's house. Pushing the door open, he realized it wasn't locked. Zhou Wufeng was extremely surprised by this and even asked aloud. There he saw a child, little Jen. Turning around to his sister, little Zheng said, "His big brother is here." Zhou Wufeng finally went inside the house after all. At the child's voice, Chou Yuyue came out and asked him what was wrong. Little Zheng pointed at the protagonist with a joyful expression and said that Big Brother had come. The girl, however, was far from pleased at this arrival. The protagonist went into the kitchen and told her to rest because he would do everything himself. Chou Yuyue was very surprised at the guy's behavior. Just then, Zhou Wufeng began to knead the dough. Chou Yuyue watched his movements and was surprised at the protagonist's diligence. Suddenly the door opened and someone walked into the house. It was Yuna. She asked with a happy expression if Chou Yuyue had cooked the noodles. However, it wasn't the girl who answered her, but Zhou Wufeng. He said that he was working on it, and it would be ready soon. The girl clearly didn't expect the guy to come and, pointing at him, asked what he was forgetting there. Meanwhile, the noodles were already coming into readiness, and Zhou Wufeng turned towards the source of the smell. Taking his hands of the dough, Zhou Wufeng said that he had started cooking here and they would talk a little later. After cooking the noodles, Zhou Wufeng used almost all of the flour. This was very quickly noticed by a schoolgirl, and with a disgruntled look on her face, she asked why he did that. However, Zhou Wufeng said with a smile on his face that everything was fine now because their family now had money. However, the girl didn't believe the guy and asked where he could get it from. With a furious expression on her face, she asked, what could Zhou Wufeng do besides changing houses, selling things, playing cards, and beating his wife? Zhou Wufeng had not expected such fury from his relatives. He lowered his hand to his pocket, pulling out something. Taking them out of his pocket, a wad of bills, and he told his sister to look at them. The girl was surprised that the guy wasn't lying. Zhou Wufeng said that they would take it. He also said that since it was important for them to pass the exams, they should eat more healthy food, and he wouldn't deny himself anything. However, the girl was unpleasantly surprised by such money because she thought her brother was going to lose it. She, as Zhou Wufeng, tried to calm her down and said that they should talk about it after dinner. He also said there that he had roasted some meat that he hadn't eaten in so long. Finally, the whole family gathered for a family dinner. The man started talking about where he got the money from. However, the whole family was unpleasantly surprised by the fact that he had taken them from their parents' murderer. After dinner, the family decided to get together and talk about what was going on. Zhou Wufeng started to say that he believes that their parents could not have died due to their carelessness, and he is sure that it was Hu Han. Zhou Wufeng is certain that he knew he had purchased faulty equipment. However, Yuna didn't see how this would help avenge their parents. Zhou Wufeng that this was why this old dog was involved in the death of their parents, because he didn't want to check the equipment. Zhou Wufeng said that he would gather evidence first. Yuna asked what he meant. Zhou Wufeng explains that they need documents to buy the equipment. He says he'll find them when he contacts the seller, and then Hu Han won't be able to escape. With fury, Zhou Wufeng says that the boys won't have to worry about all of this. He will handle it himself and prove their parents' innocence. Both Cho Yuyue and Yuna are extremely surprised by this attitude of the protagonist, so they looked at him in a stupor. Zhou Wufeng averted his eyes and gave little Zheng some change for candy. He wished Yuna good luck in her exams and told her not to worry about tuition fees, because he would take care of everything. Walking down the street, Zhou Wufeng heard about someone selling ice cream. Walking up to the shop, Zhou Wufeng said that he would buy one. The salesman took a popsicle. Giving it to the protagonist, he quoted a price of 2 fin. Zhou Wufeng took a bite and immersed himself in memories. Looking at the bench, Zhou Wufeng said that what they say is true. Every era has its own characteristics. That someone clapped the protagonist on the shoulder. Zhou Wufeng turned around to the source of the sound. There was a group of people standing there, namely 6 people. One of the girls waved at him in a friendly manner. Mentally, Zhou Wufeng scanned who approached him. Among the 6 people, he identified Fu Dahai and Zhang Zijui. The protagonist got flustered and waved back, saying they hadn't seen each other in a while. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng realized that one of the girls was Shen Zijian, and she was Zhang Xiaodo's best friend. Looking at the girl, he noticed that she was decently dressed, thinking that it was usually the richest in any group who dressed well. Suddenly, one of the men pointed at the protagonist and angrily asked why he was staring at the guys. However, another buddy in the group asked why he started up since everything was fine. However, he was unable to stop his comrade's fierce fervor. He started shouting that Zhou Wufeng was acting tough when Shen Zijian was around, and he still did not know how Zhang Xiaoduo had fallen in love with him. One of the girls giggled and said that maybe Zhang Xiaoduo likes bullies. Zhou Wufeng took the ice cream again. He swallowed it whole and whole, suddenly started waving his hands and said Xiao Shan misunderstood everything. He said that how could he act like a bully in front of his wife's friends? After the man spoke out, they tried to calm him down. The girl watched the situation with a calm face. She turned her head to the guy and said that everything was fine and they were just in the same class. She also told them to go now. After the group left, Zhou Wufeng continued to stare at their backs. Squinting his eyes, Zhou Wufeng thought that his carefree life would not last long. After Zhou Wufeng had purchased everything he needed, he would return home with 2 bags in his hands. He walked past one building and turned a corner. Zhang Xiaoduo was there. The girl clearly didn't expect a guy to come. She began wiping the remnants of her food off of herself, as if afraid he would notice. Zhou Wufeng asked if she had eaten ice cream. Zhang Xiaoduo didn't know what to say to him and only stammered. She began to explain that she hadn't had ice cream in a long time and decided to try it. She also said that she had bought him a watermelon. Zhou Wufeng smiled softly as he looked at Zhang Xiaoduo. He lifted his hand and began stroking her head. He said that they had enough money to buy whatever they wanted, and there would be even more in the future. Zhang Xiaoduo blushed and agreed with the man's words. And Zhou Wufeng offered his help. He offered to carry the watermelon because he thought she was tired. The woman denied it. Taking the girl's load, he said it was fine and he would deliver. The woman was extremely surprised by such an act on the part of the man. She blushed and called his name. Closing her eyes, she sank into reminiscing. There's Zhou Wufeng, 2 healthy thermoses. Apparently, the man decided to carry the thermos for the girl as well, while she was walking nearby and talking to the man. Turning around, Zhou Wufeng looked at his wife. He asked her why she was in the clouds and if it was time for them to go home. The woman snapped out of her stupor and opened her eyes wide. She ran up to the man and said she was on her way. So it was like they were coming home again. Suddenly there is a loud scream in the middle of the street. Someone is cursing the man to die in the street. Someone knocked insistently on the door. Suddenly opened and a man came flying out of the house. Zhou Wufeng asked Nika what really happened. The man patted the boy's shoulder and said that they should step back first. The man started to say that he had lost some money in the morning, but his wife, whom he called very insultingly, was already buzzing his ears. The man was indignant that she didn't realize that people win and lose in casinos. That man approached the protagonist and asked if he knew the principal's son. He hugged the protagonist and started saying that he was very rich, and therefore it would be easy to get him hooked on casinos. The man already started dreaming about what would happen if they teamed up. However, Zhou Wufeng shook off his hand and asked how much money he had brought. The man said he hadn't received his wife's paycheck yet and asked to borrow some money. He said he would pay her back when he got even. Zhou Wufeng scratched the back of his head and said that Nika owed 3 more yuan. He also said that he only had 1 yuan with him today. The man yelled at the protagonist and asked if that was really the case. However, Zhou Wufeng also looked at the guy strangely, for he didn't have any money either. The man had nothing to say. Zhou Wufeng had already started to ask if he should do it next time. However, the man grabbed the protagonist by the arm and said that since they were already packed, he would lend some. Unexpectedly, Nika lifted his foot and started digging into his shoe. Zhou Wufeng looked at him in bewilderment. However, it wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng opened his eyes in surprise. The man from the soul took out a few bills. It wasn't long before the company approached another house. They were met on the doorstep by another man walking with his dog. He asked if it was really Niki. Nichai said that Zhou Wufeng had also come. A man, apparently the owner of the house, asked them to pass. Nika suddenly asked the man where he had brought them to. After all, they only wanted to play. Smoking a cigarette, Brother Chen said that he had been carrying fruit for Grandpa all day today and would have to do it again tomorrow, so they could only play here. Nikai smiled and asked the man what his new game was and asked him to teach them. Chen told everyone to sit down, he's about to teach them everything. After picking up a card, the man began to explain that a standard deck of cards is used. 3 cards are placed face up on the table, and the rest are dealt equally to the 3 players. The first player to bet is the player who first received the card when it was dealt. The man continued that the highest bidder takes the cards from the table and becomes the landowner. Showing the cards, man says this is a really good game. He says the remaining 2 become peasants playing against the landowner. The man says that both peasants win if at least one of them wins. Chen continues that the combinations are simple as usual, along the lines of a pair of 3s, a pair of 4s, and so on. Holding his head with his hand, Zhou Wufeng realizes that it is Du Diju. Chen shuffles the cards and says they're about to start, and he's the landowner. And that we could hear shouts of joy. Someone shouting that he had won. Chen looks at his cards. He has a pair of 7s and a 10. The man throws the cards on the table and says he has a pair of 7s. Nisai smilingly looks at his opponent. Chen says he has 2, still smoking his cigarette. He is clearly confident of his victory. Zhou Wufeng thoughtfully says that he has a pair of 8s. Nisa takes another look at his cards and says he passes. Chen happily throws his pair of 10s. He apologizes to the guys and says he's won one more time while Zhou Wufeng goes over the cards. Chen looked at what kind of deck he had. Smiling, he says he has a pair of 6s and 2 combinations again. Zhou Wufeng thoughtfully throws a pair of kings on the table. Then suddenly Nisei says it's his turn and furiously throws his 2 cards. It turns out to be a pair of aces, the highest suit. However, Zhou Wufeng looks at him with bewilderment. The guy belatedly remembers that he is supposed to go for the landowner, not the protagonist. Chen passes and says the guys are cool, lighting a cigarette. Nikai, looking into his deck, says that he has nothing else to go around and can only throw senior cards. Chen happily picks up on his opponent's idea and shows a jack. Chen asks the protagonist if he passes. After agreeing, Chen says that he has won again. Nietzsche gives Cheng a thumbs up and praises him for playing well. Zhou Wufeng squints his eyes as he looks at the 2 of them. The guy looked into his deck. There was a rack of 2s. Zhou Wufeng scratched the back of his head and said that he had bullshit again, not cards. His 2 opponents looked up and laid out their cards. Nika took another look at his cards and asked if it was his move, then said he had a bomb of 6s. That's when Zhou Wufeng pulls out his rack of 2s. The protagonist pompously threw his cards down on the table. At the same time, Niki opened his eyes in surprise, because he didn't expect such a combination. Clearly agitated, Chen said that he was passing. Zhou Wufeng was starting to get excited about his winnings. He had 3 bombs and a black joker. Then Zhou Wufeng looked at Nikai and asked where his money was. However, the boys didn't end there. Someone posted a pair of 2s again. Chen yells for more throws when the other 2 pass. Showing a deuce, Chen winced once again. He exhaled the smoke left from the cigarette. Nietzsche was already angry, throwing the cards on the table. I guess he had no luck at all. Zhou Wufeng says that he owes the protagonist almost 100 yuan already, to which the protagonist angrily says that a couple more games and he'll break even. Shuffling the cards, Zhou Wufeng says that Nisai has nothing at all to bet, and asked if he had stashed any more money in his socks. The man completely freaks out and says not to talk to him like he's cheap since they're not done yet. After Zhou Wufeng shuffled the cards, he throws them onto the table with fury. Approaching the man, Zhou Wufeng says that how he wants to talk to him. He starts to say rudely that if he wants to play, let him get the money, and if he has no money, let him go home. However, he moved even closer and began to speak a threat. With an angry look on his face, he said that if he touched his wife again, he would bury him alive. Turning around to Cheng standing in a stupor, Zhou Wufeng clearly softened his face and thanked him for playing. He also said that they should probably stop here. He said that he had won quite a bit, so he would treat tomorrow at his expense. Chen only stood silently by the side smoking a cigarette. The protagonist was already walking home at dawn. He thinks that Chen Goda's father is a former factory director and has quite a few connections, meaning he will definitely be able to help the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng finally made it home after all. The man straight up spat on the bed from exhaustion, unable to do anything else. However, Zhou Wufeng turned around at the shout. He listened with bags under his eyes as someone accused them of losing all the money and how they would survive. Hearing a groan, the protagonist sighed and went back to sleep. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng found himself in the Wuet Chaikana. He went to the table and asked the boss for a cup of tea. He was quoted a price of 5 fines. After Zhou Wufeng paid, he was poured some fragrant tea. Suddenly, he turns around at an unexpected voice. Someone asks how Wu Liu's son is doing. It was a conversation between two men. One of them said that he had just picked up and quit when the other had absolutely no idea what was on his mind. Zhou Wufeng took a sip of tea, thinking about how the 80s were difficult. However, he also recalled that many millionaires started their businesses around this time. Zhou Wufeng turned around and looked at the views from the window. Zhou Wufeng thought that if he went back to the 2020th year, he would be very foolish to miss a great opportunity. Zhou Wufeng still remained in the Wu Weiqian tea house, immersed in his thoughts. The boy clutched his head and wondered if his thoughts were right. He has a hard-earned career that he doesn't want to give up. Opening his eyes, the protagonist made a decision for himself. Looking up, Zhou Wufeng thought that once he dealt with Hu Han, he would go back to where he came from. Pretty soon the rumble from the motorcycle engine could be heard from the street side as well. Watching Chen park, Zhou Wufeng thought that he had finally arrived. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng came out of the tea house and called out to the man. The man turned around at the source of the sound and asked if it was really Zhou Wufeng. The main characters only said what a coincidence it was as Chen scratched the back of his head and said that he had just finished helping his grandfather and was very tired. Zhou Wufeng started to say that he was very timely because they should have lunch together and that it was a small compensation for yesterday. Chen spread his hands and said that it was just nothing. Zhou Wufeng said no, it was not nothing, and invited him to the restaurant. After the guys sat down at the table, a waitress came over and asked them what they wanted. Zhou Wufeng asked for a menu. Looking at the prices on the menu, Zhou Wufeng was very surprised. Everything was very expensive. Mao Tai vodka cost 7 yuan, fish stew almost 3, when ginseng chicken cost 4.5 yuan. After the order came, Chen turned to the protagonist and asked that it was indeed very polite of him. But wasn't it too expensive? Zhou Wufeng patted the protagonist on the shoulder and poured him a drink and said it was fine. He says that he was lucky to have lunch with him so he can enjoy himself. Unexpectedly, the same group of friends of the protagonist's wife also entered this restaurant. They noticed that Zhou Wufeng was eating there too. One of them pointed at the protagonist and asked if he had come here to waste money. Zhou Wufeng calmly chewed his food without paying attention to such provocations. The same man started shouting as he didn't hear the main character's answer. He called him a freak and asked what he thought Zhang Xiaoduo was eating. "You're the one girl said she lost her appetite and told the guys they'd eat somewhere else." Our new one had to be calmed down, and the whole group headed for the exit. Chen, listening to the conversation between the protagonist, asked about the protagonist's relationship with Hu Han's son. Zhou Wufeng replied that they used to be in the same class and often quarreled. The man lit himself a cigarette and only said he understood. Changing the subject, Chen said that Zhou Wufeng gave in to him yesterday and asked if he really thought he wouldn't notice. Zhou Wufeng apologized for the counter-question, but he also asked what his relationship with Hu Han was. Nu also said that when he asked this earlier, he seemed displeased. The company continued their conversation in the restaurant. Chen said that he would tell you about it, and he began to talk about how when the director of the factory was chosen, he gave his vote to Xu Changjiang, which was the reason why Chen himself did not become the director. He said that he was only one vote short. Remembering the events that had happened, Chen only became more annoyed. He began to say that his father had been the director before him until he retired. Slamming the table, he started calling Hu Han a traitor. Zhou Wufeng, seeing his comrade's tense mood, approached him and tried to calm him down by pouring wine. Zhou Wufeng began to calmly ask who Chu Changjiang was and if he was the son of the director of Linshui Steel Factory. Chen drank all the wine in a gulp. After he took the glass away from his mouth, he said it wasn't true, as he was just a guy on good terms with a foreign supplier. Zhou Wufeng began to say that there was no point in him working hard in this factory if he could go to the sea. Chen said he thought so too, but his father was against it. Chen put his finger up and decided to tell the protagonist something. He said that a friend of his made electrical appliances to Shanghai last year and made over 100,000. Immediately afterwards, he said that it was dollars, not yuan, and that his friend had become a millionaire. He rhetorically asked when he would run out of money. Zhou Wufeng raised a finger up and said that it was really cool. The man also said that the factory would soon be paying a fee for heat stroke prevention, and there's a considerable amount of money there isn't there. Chen agreed and asked what it affected. Zhou Wufeng asked if he would be paid money if he supplied the food collected by his family. However, the man immediately threw up his hands at such an offer. Chen said that if he did that, he would get in trouble eating. Grandpa would find out about it. However, Zhou Wufeng immediately clapped himself on his chest and said that this was the moment he was entering the conversation, because his grandfather would become the grandfather of the protagonist. However, the man did not understand such an idiom and asked what Zhou Wufeng meant. Zhou Wufeng began to explain that he would be the middleman delivering the fruit, and the man should just use his name. Chen clapped the protagonist on the shoulder and thought about how he hadn't even thought of it. He also called the protagonist a genius. After the company left the restaurant, Zhou Wufeng offered to escort the man home. Chen was surprised because he didn't know that Zhou Wufeng could drive a motorcycle. Zhou Wufeng said it wasn't that hard. After both of them got behind the wheel, Chen said that Zhou Wufeng was a pretty good driver. Zhou Wufeng thanked him for the compliment. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng found himself at home. Opening the door, Zhou Wufeng thought that Zhang Xiaoduo must be asleep by now, and after all, it was already late. However, after looking around, Zhou Wufeng realized that she was awake and was humbly waiting for him. When Zhou Wufeng came home, it was already late at night. He approached wife and asked why she was still awake. The woman was silent. The protagonist started scratching the back of his head, and he apologized for coming back so late. The woman turned away, immersed in her own thoughts. She recalled her friend asking who was more important to her family or her unhappy husband. The woman talked about how her aunt had been hospitalized and was still in a coma when the woman visited her. The aunt mumbled about her all the time. Zhang Xiaoduo lowered her eyebrows and said that he was so reformed, but she didn't have time to say it. A friend said she'd rather have cancer on a mountain of pigs than moral freaks get better, and also asked her what else she expects from a player who only knows how to beat up women on a daily basis. Zhou Wufeng walked over to his wife and asked if everything was all right, if there was any problem. Suddenly, the woman began to cry. She rose from her chair, barely shuffling her feet. She immediately embraced the protagonist. She blushed, after which said he could do whatever he wanted to her today. She pressed her whole body against the protagonist, expecting something from him. Zhou Wufeng blushed heavily and darted his eyes at his wife's actions. Pretty soon it was past midnight. Zhou Wufeng was lying on the sofa thinking about something. He remembered what he had done at that moment. The man called her name. He put his arm around the woman's shoulders, putting distance between them. He said he wasn't feeling well today and would go for a walk, and told her to go to bed without him. After that, the main character came to the bathroom and opened the faucet. In his mind, they say that he needs to calm down. He put his head under the running water, trying to regain consciousness. The man only thought about the fact that he was going to come back, and that it was not worth it to do what was not asked. Soon the morning came. Auntie Wang's rooster again announced the dawn. Zhang Xiaoduo walked out of the house, immersed in her thoughts. She turned around and looked at the front door. She remembered her husband saying he would go. Turning around, she kept mentally remembering his name. Walking away, she only thought about the fact that if he had changed a little earlier, she wouldn't have had to wait. A telephone exchange came into view. Someone was dialing a phone number. It turns out that it was Zhang Xiaoduo who decided to call her father. Her dad got very excited when he found out that it was her who called and asked what was wrong. He also said that he was always willing to help. With sadness in her voice, Zhang Xiaoduo said that it was fine, she just misses her a lot. The man in a serious voice told her not to go anywhere and to wait for him. He would bring her home soon. At the same time, the fruit in the garden was ripe. It was Zhou Wufeng and Chen who were talking to each other. Chen said that he told his father about the plan, and surprisingly the latter did not resent it and even agreed. Zhou Wufeng was surprised at such an event. The man also said that Chen was lucky to have such connections. Satisfied, Chen said that if things went well, he would pay him 100 yuan. Zhou Wufeng folded his hands and told him not to worry because everything would go fine. Very soon, Zhou Wufeng was already home. Auntie said that Zhou Wufeng had returned and his relatives had come to see him. Zhou Wufeng interrogated which relatives were being talked about. Squinting his eyes, Zhou Wufeng thought that these were his wife's relatives. Opening the door, Zhou Wufeng watched the scene unfold. The wife's family, her father and mother were gathered there, as was Zhang Xiaoduo herself. Zhou Wufeng was happy to see them and asked when they had time to arrive, because if they had given him a warning, he would have prepared for their arrival. The father, with an expressionless look on his face, looked at the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng walked up to them and asked if they were hungry since he could cook something. Abruptly, however, the father swung around. A man slapped the main character with all his might, said it was for his daughter. He started yelling at the guy and told him to see what he did to his daughter. Zhang Xiaoduo called out to her father. Zhou Wufeng had nothing to say, so he only remained silent. Soon, her father swung once more and said that it was for him. Zhang Xiaoduo tried to stop her father, saying that she shouldn't do that. The screams of the protagonist's wife caused the father to stop. A woman approached the protagonist, asking if he was okay. In the same way, Zhou Wufeng understood why he was slapped. He said that his father did everything right and he was a disappointment to her in the past. Immediately after that, he apologized to her. Zhang Xiaoduo did not expect such a development. Immediately afterward, his father shouted that he had stopped talking Zhang Xiaoduo up, and they should divorce immediately. The conversation still hadn't ended and Zhou Wufeng and his company were still standing outside the house. Both Zhou Wufeng and Zhang Xiaoduo were silent as they looked at each other. Zhang Xiaoduo's mother, trembling, begged the protagonist to spare her daughter. The woman began to cry, unable to hold back her tears. Her husband tried to calm the woman down. Despite the unfolding in front of him, Zhou Wufeng asked his wife what she thought about it. She averted her eyes and hesitated. It wasn't long before she turned her back on the protagonist. Stepping back a little further, Zhang Xiaoduo called out the name of the main character. With a grim expression on her face, she said they should get a divorce. The couple then went up to the registry office to write divorce papers. The assistant told the protagonist and the woman that now he would set the seal, everything would be done, as if warning that there would be no turning back. Both only nodded their heads at this, waiting for the end. The man has already started saying that he doesn't understand the younger generation. He then stamped us a certificate of dissolution of marriage between the protagonist and the woman. By sundown, everything was ready. After that, the company walked out of the registry office. Zhou Wufeng was walking by himself when Zhang Xiaoduo went home with her parents. When they were about to leave, Zhang Xiaoduo told her parents that they needed to talk to the protagonist alone. The woman held out the money to the protagonist. She said that this was the money he gave her, and that there were 285 yuan. However, Zhou Wufeng did not take the money and only gestured for her to take it for herself. Zhou Wufeng told her to keep them because he owed her too much. The man said he was ashamed to take anything from her. Zhou Wufeng was about to leave already, and he abruptly asked the woman that if she suddenly returned to her old way of life, that she cut all ties with him. The women queried the meaning of such a request from the protagonist. She, as Zhou Wufeng, didn't want to explain anything anymore, and only said that the woman had understood him correctly. He also said that her parents were already waiting for her, and there was worth going already. The woman was still trying to find out the meaning of the sentence. She very soon Zhou Wufeng told her to take care of herself and left. Afterward, the woman cried lonely tears. The girl's tear briefly left the girl's cheek before it fell to the pavement. Letting go of his wife, Zhou Wufeng once again found himself on the street. Chen ran to him shouting that they had succeeded. Zhou Wufeng was quietly eating ice cream at the time. Running up to the main character, the man said the factory had sent a notice that the fat warning fee would be replaced by fruit. With joy on his face, the man said that they had promised 1,500 yuan for each installment. Clenching his fists, Chen said that he hoped for further cooperation and he would personally pay extra when everything was perfect. Zhou Wufeng thanked the man but said that they hadn't bought the packages yet. Riding a motorcycle, Zhou Wufeng talked to Chen. The man said that the nearest plastic factory was in Lujing. Zhou Wufeng asked a counter-question if he knew anyone there since the plastic factory they would be dealing with is a small business. Chen was very surprised at the protagonist's question because he thought that the protagonist had connections there. Zhou Wufeng said that he had no one there and would have to think of something. Chen at that moment was not really scared because he said that they would be exposed if they did not get the packages. It wasn't long before the group arrived at the plant. Zhou Wufeng reported the matter to his comrade. Chen asked what way will they enter. Zhou Wufeng that they would stop by right away. However, they were stopped by a guard and asked who they were. It wasn't long before the protagonist stopped the motorcycle. The protagonist told the guard to call his boss because they have a serious case. Hotline is always unavailable. The guard asked if they were looking for Mr. Li. Zhou Wufeng asked which office. The guard replied that they were on the 3rd floor, the first room to the left of the stairs. Zhou Wufeng thanked the guard. Chen was still worried because they got in, but Zhou Wufeng does not know the director. Zhou Wufeng said that the man would have to be quiet for this. Pretty soon the comrades were outside Mr. Li's office. Hearing a knock on the door and the supervisor, Li said to come in. After that, Zhou Wufeng and a man entered the office. Mr. Li asked who they were. Zhou Wufeng smiled affably and said that he was the director of Guoda Fruits and that he was happy to see him. Mr. Li asked how the company got here. Zhou Wufeng said they alerted the guards. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng said that to be honest, they were passing by. They were on their way to Zhehai to buy a batch of plastic bags. Zhou Wufeng said that he had heard that this factory also had pretty good bags. The man said they were in the fruit transportation business. Mr. Li pondered the words about exporting. Sipping his tea, Mr. Li waved his hand and said that they definitely wouldn't fit their bags. There was a plaque nailed in the office about dignity and honesty. Taking out his cigarettes, Zhou Wufeng wondered how they wouldn't fit. Zhou Wufeng said that he went to Ligshui to buy fruit, but they had run out of packs. Immediately after that, he held out cigarettes to Mr. Li. Lighting a cigarette, Zhou Wufeng said, the thing is that they did not calculate the cost of transportation, so they came to them. The supervisor said that he understood everything. After that, Zhou Wufeng spread his hands and said that quality assurance is their priority after all. They are a big company after all. Mr. didn't start out asking public or private enterprise from the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng, on the other hand, changed the subject and asked if Mr. Lee would like a mug. Mr. Lee seemed to come to his senses, looking at the box of tea in his cupboard. He kept talking about how he'd forgotten to pour tea for them. Approaching the main character with a teapot and brewed leaves, the man said that this tea was store-bought, and he hopes they don't mind. After that, Zhou Wufeng cut to the chase. He said that their company was dealing with a big order and asked if they could make a ton of bags in half a month. Making tea, Mr. Lee interrogated if it was really a ton, but that Zhou Wufeng replied, agree. After thinking about it, the supervisor said that if they were to work overtime, they should be able to keep up. Zhou Wufeng was satisfied with this answer and said that he would like to see the quality inspection packages. After that, the supervisor brought the company to the warehouse. He pointed out the instances of plastic bags, and they could inspect to check the quality. Zhou Wufeng shook hands with the boss and said that they would send their man tomorrow to report the results of the inspection to them. Mr. Elevator asked if they were leaving already, because they could go to restaurants to discuss something. However, Zhou Wufeng said that they had business to attend to, and perhaps they would do it next time, saying goodbye to the man. Waving the man goodbye, Zhou Wufeng said that they would see each other next time. After the company left the building, Chen started praising the protagonist. After all, they haven't even spent even a fun and already have bags. Turning to the man, Zhou Wufeng told him to call Director Lee tomorrow and tell him that the packages did not pass the quality inspection, so the transaction will not take place. After the company returned home, Chen shouted happily that you could drag a cow away in those bags. Walking up to the man, Zhou Wufeng told him to stop suffering nonsense. Crossing his arms, Zhou Wufeng asked if the man had promised to take him to a restaurant in the city. Chen was surprised that the protagonist still remembered that, and said that he just hadn't tasted his grandfather's rice. Zhou Wufeng hesitated and averted his eyes. He realized that his plans were missing something, and he needed Nisai. Zhou Wufeng approached Chen and said that they should ask Liu Niki for help. After listening to the man, Chen was surprised at such a suggestion, and said that he had cheated the last time they played. Zhou Wufeng told him not to worry so much and just call after all. They live near each other but rarely see each other. It wasn't long before the company arrived at the town's hotel restaurant. Chen and Zhou Wufeng only silently watched Nika as he ate the entire table at an extreme speed, being extremely hungry. After dinner, Zhou Wufeng said goodbye to Chen and said that they would see each other next time. Ni smiled at the protagonist and asked what they were up to with Godu. Zhou Wufeng replied that they were doing nothing. However, Nika did not believe the protagonist told him not to lie, because he heard that he wanted to pull him into some kind of deal. Clapping himself on the chest, the man said he was ready. Zhou Wufeng scratched in the back of his head and thought about whether or not he was telling him. Nisi spread her hands and said that they have known each other for 100 years, unlike Chen. Resolved, the protagonist told me how it was. Nisai was surprised at the offer, after all. They were giving 200 yuan for some fruit delivery tomorrow. As if caring for the protagonist, the man said that he wanted to remind him that the last time they played he had forced him to cheat, and told the guy not to let himself be fooled. Zhou Wufeng averted his eyes and only laughed to himself. Zhou Wufeng wryly thanked the man for reminding him that he was so stupid and how he only managed to fool him. Right after that, Zhou Wufeng said that he would give the man 50 yuan if he went with them. But this time, Nisai didn't refuse such a generous offer. After that, the man invited the protagonist to hang out for a while. Zhou Wufeng agreed to the proposal. Upon entering the house, Zhou Wufeng asked if he had bought it or only rented it, and the man brought on a major cup of alcohol. Fiddling with the cup in general, she said that of course he rents all the money, he has no money. Zhou Wufeng asked how come he is the only locksmith in the area, he has no competition, and there is a big demand. Nika turned to the protagonist and asked him what he was talking about, since he had long since quit. The man said he'd been caught opening a lock when the neighbors didn't know what he was doing. After that, Zhou Wufeng's eyes lit up and asked the man to teach him how to do so. The man began to explain. He showed the protagonist a hook and said that they usually use one of these to open doors. Leaning against the door, Nika told the protagonist to look carefully, or he wouldn't see anything. After fiddling with the lock, the man tried to open it. It was not long before he succeeded. The lock opened with a distinctive sound. Zhou Wufeng began to praise Nikai and asked him to teach him to do the same. Waving his finger, the man said he didn't want to set him up since it wasn't exactly legal. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng said that he would give the man 100 after the fruit transaction. Then already Nikai's own eyes lit up, and he joyfully taught the protagonist this skill. It wasn't long before the team found themselves at the Linshui steel mill. Zhou Wufeng said hello to Chen, who arrived on a motorcycle. Chen asked what Nikai was doing here, to which Zhou Wufeng said that he had come to help. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng and company decided to get down to business. Rolling up his sleeves, Zhou Wufeng thought that he couldn't afford to do this too soon, because the relationship between Hu Han and Xu Changjiang wasn't the easiest. Squinting, the protagonist thought there was some machinations going on behind their backs between vendors. Quite soon, Zhou Wufeng approached the company. Chen was perplexed and asked what the protagonist was wearing. Zhou Wufeng asked if it is not obvious that he is a farmer. A hat is his headgear. Showing his buddy a thumbs up, Chen praised the protagonist for his foresight. She said that the fruit was in the warehouse and the rest was up to him. Pretty soon it was well over 12 o'clock in the afternoon. There were employees in the cafeteria. Apparently it was lunchtime. Zhou Wufeng thought that the workers usually had lunch at the cafe at this time, allowing them to gain strength. He also said that it was worth leaving everything here. It wasn't long before the company was almost done carrying the fruit. Suddenly, Zhou Wufeng cried out in pain. Nika asked the protagonist what's wrong with him. Zhou Wufeng, grabbing his stomach, said that something was making his stomach twist. Right after that, the main character ran out and said he had to go out. He trusted Nika to finish the job and said he would be back soon. Zhou Wufeng thought that he should hurry while everyone was still in the cafe. Rounding the corner, he found himself outside Hu Han's office. Yanking the handle, Zhou Wufeng realized that the doors were closed. Zhou Wufeng called the man a parasite because he closes his office door for lunch. With a grin, Zhou Wufeng thanked past himself for being so well prepared. Breaking open the door, Zhou Wufeng yanked on the handle. The door appeared to be open. Zhou Wufeng looked around. Going through the books, the protagonist tried to find something worthwhile. Pretty soon he found the sales contracts. However, he was extremely surprised that there was no stamp on the contract and thought of a signed contract. Thought about how the books on the shelf were really good. However, it wasn't long before he had doubts whether Hu Han would actually read them. Zhou Wufeng and company were still in the factory. Zhou Wufeng decided to pick up the book on the shelf. However, the guy didn't expect the book to be so heavy. With a rumbling sound, Zhou Wufeng lowered the book and it fell to the floor. Turning around, Zhou Wufeng wondered if this book was really a book after all. Why did it hear a sound like it had shattered? Opening the book, the protagonist saw a stack of papers. The protagonist looked around once more. Turning around, Zhou Wufeng realized that it wasn't a book but a box. He started rummaging through the papers, thinking there might be something important in there. It wasn't long before he got the equipment delivery document. The squint in Zhou Wufeng's eyes realized that this was exactly what he was looking for, and soon Hu Han would be finished. After removing the evidence and locking the door, Zhou Wufeng returned to his company. Nika asked where Zhou Wufeng was if he had fallen into a push. He also said that he was almost done with everything. Zhou Wufeng gave 100 to Nikai. He didn't expect the guy to actually do it. Bowing to the protagonist, Niki thanked the protagonist and said that he would take care of everything. Here in the building, the protagonist looked at the documents again. As it turned out, it was a document with an official seal for a value of 2.5 million yuan. Zhou Wufeng thought it was suicide, not proof. At the same time, a group of friends passed by Ziyu's side. They greeted the girl, and just as affably, the girl greeted them. Some other girl greeted Ziyu as the man complimented her. The girl turned around, looking at unexpected face. Ziyu asked what he was doing here. The group turned to the main character and started laughing that he was walking around. The man began by saying that divorcees are lucky. They have so much free time that they can finally give to themselves. One girl sympathized with Zhang Xiaoduo. She thought that it would not be easy for a divorced woman to remarry. At the same time, the man said that it was only a matter of time. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng approached Ziyu. The man was angry at the guy being ignored. He grabbed his arm and shouted his name furiously. He started shaming the guy in front of his friends for his clothes. Zhou Wufeng turned around and looked at the cocky man who grabbed his arm. He grabbed the man by the throat and told him not to be rude to him. With a sharp movement, Zhou Wufeng twisted the man. He started screaming that he was in great pain because his arm had been twisted. Soon a group of friends started defending him and told the protagonist to let the guy go. With a sharp movement, Zhou Wufeng told the guy to go and let him go. However, because of this move, the guy cheered the girl along with him. With a violent rumble, they both ended up on the pavement. Zhou Wufeng cracked his knuckles and said that if he didn't mind saying nonsense in the back, then let him try to say it to his face. At the time, the man was lying in front of the protagonist. However, the man didn't like the guy's tone, and the man barely stood up to ask what he had just said. Zhou Wufeng crossed his brows and said that if you speak at him, you are translating to yourself. With fury, the man replied why he was always lashing out and why he was making a fool of himself as soon as he got the money out of his father. Zhou Wufeng spread his hands and said that that father had until Monday to live. The man was extremely angry and said that he was fed up with Zhou Wufeng and was ready to fight with him. Zhou Wufeng walked up to the man closely and asked what he would do to him, and asked if his father had cheated on him. The man surprisingly interrogated what Zhou Wufeng was talking about. Suddenly, the boy remembered snippets of how his father had acted that month. He also recalled his father going to a hotel with an unknown woman, with a doomed look on his face as if he understood everything. The man only knelt down and began to say that it wasn't true. Turning his back to him, Zhou Wufeng said that he knew about it. It wasn't long before the protagonist left the company and approached Ziyu. He approached the girl with a request. He asked her to lend him the phone and he would pay her for it. Soon the couple was inside the house. There was a pleasant atmosphere. Approaching the phone, the woman asked the protagonist where to call and asked him to dictate the number. The protagonist started to say that he needed to call Xinyang Equipment Factory and asked for Qinbao Ma's number. Soon the woman said she answered and told him to pick up the phone. The person on the other side of the phone said that it was Xinyang Factory Equipment and that the protagonist was interested. Zhou Wufeng said to call Qinbao Ma to the phone. The voice nervously asked who was speaking. Zhou Wufeng said that it was the director of Linshui Factory. The employee asked if it was really so since he didn't recognize their number and asked if it was a home phone. Zhou Wufeng said it was a new one and he had important business. The staff member said it was fine and asked him to tell him about the situation. Zhou Wufeng said that the goods Huhan purchased in April and May and June do not pass quality control. Zhou Wufeng said that from their low-quality equipment, there was a fatal incident in their factory. He shouted that they would be held responsible. The staff member abruptly stood up from the table and asked what it was that Zhou Wufeng was talking about. After all, Huhan had summoned him around that time and said that no further details were needed. Zhou Wufeng asked why their name was put in the responsible person column in the contract then. The man asked to get their manager on the phone. Zhou Wufeng said that their managers are now the reception room, so said to call him on their phone. Pretty soon there was the sound of the end of the conversation. At that time, the atmosphere in the principal's office was extremely calm. The director was quietly sipping his tea, not thinking about the problems. Suddenly he heard the phone ring. The director picked up the phone. The staff member began to quickly say that there were no contracts between them and Huhan. The principal told them to speak slowly and asked what happened. The employee began to say that their company did not sign any contracts with the plant company in April, May, and June. The director questioned whether Huhan had really not signed any contracts with them for 3 months. The staff member said that one of their employees called him and asked about them. The staff member said he mentioned that they would be taking charge and asked what was even going on while the principal's face contorted into a frightened grimace. The man asked what number they had gotten the call from. After the end of the conversation, the man thought that he had obviously received a call from someone other than their company. As he continued his thoughts, the man guessed that they had received a call from someone outside the company. That is, they already had evidence and knew something. The man recalled that they have the biggest sales in April, May, and June, and during this period they earned more than 3 million. Pensive, the director wondered if Huhan didn't sign the contract, it was what he was spending the company's money on. Suddenly, it hit him. Their company had had an accident where a married couple had died because of improper use of equipment. The man realized something was wrong. Immediately after that thought, the man ran over to his desk. Practically stumbling, he called his subordinate. He said to stop all the cars in Division 2, and also said not to say anything about it to Huhan. Immediately afterward, he dialed the number of the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng was leaning against the wall at the time, and talking about how everything would be soon. It wasn't long before the bell rang. Zhou Wufeng said with a smile that he was on his way. As expected, the director of the Linshui factory called the protagonist's phone. The director hurriedly introduced himself. However, Zhou Wufeng barely heard him finish saying that he had all the evidence on Huhan. The man tensed up and told the protagonist to continue. Zhou Wufeng said that Huhan made a contract with Xinyang Factory Equipment as a result of the deception to gain more than 3 million yuan. As the man's face turned almost purple, Zhou Wufeng said he later signed a contract with the Sikh company and purchased the same amount of spare parts. The man asked if he really had everything on him. Zhou Wufeng said yes. Immediately afterward, the man said that he would come to him immediately. Zhou Wufeng said he agreed, but warned that it would be better if the man went to the police on his own behalf because he did not want to be punished. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng hung up the phone. After that, the principal wondered who could be on the other side of the phone call, for he had a young voice, but he was very smart. Zhou Wufeng thought that if he were him, he would immediately go to the police and thought that he himself had done him a big favor. At the same time, the girl whose phone was borrowed stood in a stupor. She tried to analyze the main character's conversation. She realized that he had called the director of the Linshui factory and was talking about something important. At the same time, the principal came out of the building and said he needed an emergency car and asked a staff member to borrow it. Immediately afterward, the director went to see the protagonist. It wasn't long before the protagonist heard a knock on their room. He went over to open the door. As soon as Zhou Wufeng did that, the director asked if he was the person who called him. Right after that, the principal dug into his memories and realized that he was the son of the couple who died in that incident. Zhou Wufeng told the director to go through and provided him with evidence. The man looked over both contracts. He thought that on these contracts and this signature would be enough to prove his guilt. Immediately afterward, the man clapped the protagonist on the shoulder. Turning to the guy, the man asked his name and said he was a hero. Waving his hands, Zhou Wufeng said that the director himself found the evidence on Hu Han, and the guy didn't do anything at all. Immediately afterward, police rushed to the apartment. A group of people approached the principal and called out to him. The policeman ran up to the protagonist and asked what had happened after all. They asked the director who he was talking to on the phone and then ran off somewhere. The principal decided to look at the guy, however. The guy only turned away. He realized that Zhou Wufeng had decided to set this all up to protect him from responsibility. The man held out the documents to the police officer and told him to consider them. He said he found these contracts in Hu Han's office and said it was direct evidence of his fraudulent scheme. After that, he looked at the main character and said that his action caused 2 people to die, and he would tell everything in detail. After she explained everything to the cops, the director clapped the protagonist on the shoulders, approving of his actions. It was well after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Zhou Wufeng testified to the police that Hu Han to the death of his parents and said everything in detail. The policeman turned to the principal, asked if everything the guy said was really true, to which the principal said yes. The policeman asked the guy if the man knew his schemes had been exposed, to which Zhou Wufeng said he didn't think so. Zhou Wufeng said that right now he should be at home or at his office at work. The guy also said that he thought he would be easy to find through his immediate family. The policeman shuddered nervously, for he marveled at the fact that the fellow had guessed his thoughts. The police then approached the principal and told him they would send a squad right away and asked him to come with them. Meanwhile, there was a great atmosphere in the factory. Hu Han calmly made herself tea without thinking about anything. In prostration, he decided to look at his surroundings. And then he shuddered in surprise. He was frightened because the books were not in the right order. He was so scared that he dropped the cup of boiling water on the floor. Going through the papers in the book he was afraid of where the equipment contract had gone, he decided to think and remember what had happened that day. He remembered that there was a farmer walking around the factory. He also thought that it didn't look like he was a factory worker. The man thought he must have seen him somewhere, and then it hit him. It was Zhou Wufeng. Meanwhile, Zhou Wufeng made his way home to his children. Little Zheng opened the door for him. He was clearly happy to see the protagonist. However, unlike him, the rest of the family was extremely surprised by the arrival of the protagonist. Especially surprised were the schoolgirl's classmates who came to study. Zhou Yuyue approached the protagonist and asked him why he had come here. Zhou Wufeng said he was just passing by. Zhou Wufeng remembered that Yuna had an exam coming up. The girl agreed to the guy's proposal. Zhou Wufeng said that he wanted to say a few words to her, and thus hinting that they wanted to talk alone. After that, Yuna's classmates said that they would already go and they would meet tomorrow. The girl grabbed hold of the guy's shirt and said they had to go. A classmate said to let him go, saying that Zhou Wufeng wanted to say it was important. However, the girl seemed to know the protagonist, because she said that he had come to sell something as usual because he had lost everything. Zhou Wufeng only looked at their backs in silence. After that, Zhou Wufeng summoned all 3 relatives. Zhou Wufeng pointed to himself and said that he had dealt with Hu Han. Zhou Wufeng said not to worry about him anymore. However, Yuna was extremely frightened and pointed at the person behind the protagonist's back. It turned out to be Hu Han himself. Zhou Wufeng abruptly turned his head around, not expecting to see this person. There, with a furious face, stood Hu Han. Zhou Wufeng covered his relatives with his hands and told him to enter. Hu Han, with eyes burning with rage, said that it was indeed him. It's like a crazy man threw himself at the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng easily dodged the suck of the obvious punch. Immediately afterward, he swung his arm to make a counterattack. Immediately after Zhou Wufeng squeezed the rogue's arm behind his back, Hu Han cried out about how hurt he was. Zhou Wufeng smiled and asked what he needed to bring back and said to speak more specifically. He also mentioned if he was looking for a contract with Xenon Company or Seek Company. The man with angry eyes said to give it to them right now. The protagonist wasn't in a great mood either and reminded the villain of what he was in for. Such a threat made the scoundrel yell even louder. Immediately afterwards, Zhou Wufeng swung his leg to strike Hu Han. Releasing him from his tight grip, the guy stepped toward the man. Immediately after that, Zhou Wufeng walked over to the table where he picked up a bottle of alcohol. With a sharp movement, he smashed the bottle against the nearest sharp corner. Yuna was extremely surprised by this action. Zhou Yuyue didn't remain poised either and opened her eyes wide at the protagonist's actions. Putting the rest of the bottle to his throat, Zhou Wufeng asked the scoundrel if he now realized what he had gotten himself into. The man couldn't adequately assess the situation and could barely make out his words. Frightened for his life, he replied that yes, he understood. After that, Zhou Wufeng slapped the rascal hard and asked him again if he understood exactly. From such a hard blow, the man screamed and fell to the floor. After a series of blows, blood flowed from behind Rascal's mouth and nose. Sitting on his knees in front of the protagonist, he said in a trembling voice that he was aware of it. The blood man asked what the protagonist needed. With burning eyes at Zhou Wufeng, he said that it was for his parents. The protagonist was not on a joke angry as he himself was trembling with anger. However, he wasn't the only one in this state. Yuna was also furious to the extreme while Cho Yue tried to calm her down. The man said he had nothing to do with their deaths. He cried out that they had known each other for years and really sorry about that. Zhou Wufeng said he understood. Trying to dispel the protagonist's misunderstanding, the man says he said that before. Raising his hands, the man said to give him the contract because it's the state. If they find out about it, they will arrest him for sure. As if frightened by the man's threats, Zhou Wufeng said that he could give up the contract. Putting his hand on the man's shoulder, the protagonist said something he hid it. After all, why would he lug around such papers? With a strained smile, Hu Han hustled the protagonist. Both girls stared at the protagonist in bewilderment. The protagonist returned to them with a soft nod of his head. After Zhou Wufeng left the house, a fair amount of time had already passed. Sunset had come, but the company still hadn't stopped. After walking for such a long time, Hu Han asked where Zhou Wufeng was going. Turning to him, Zhou Wufeng said to be quiet as Zhou Wufeng wanted to talk about how they would divide the money. The man began to deny that he didn't have any money because he had given him everything that time. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng's shoulder slapped his cheek and said not to lie to him. Not otherwise, it carries the contract of his superiors. Zhou Wufeng rubbed his hands together and asked where he was making 2.5 million. The scoundrel who was on the floor from the strong blow was surprised because he knew everything. Zhou Wufeng spread his hands and said that he knows everything, so stop pretending, because Zhou Wufeng does not want to take away a single yuan from the man. Zhou Wufeng said not to worry because since he was on his side, he didn't have to worry that he would throw him away or he would be in trouble with him. Right after that, the main character's face turned sinister. He said that when he bought new equipment in July, he should replace low-quality equipment with high-quality equipment, and then no one would realize anything. The man got up and said that yes he would, and they could keep walking. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng withdrew into the complete wilderness. They found themselves in a cemetery. Hu Han started digging the grave of one of his ancestors, trying to find something there. Only Zhou Wufeng stood aside as if he had nothing to do. After digging up 100,000, the man gave it to the protagonist and told him not to forget about their pact. The main characters from told him to open the bags and look at the money. Seeing that there was exactly 100,000, the guy smiled evilly. Quite soon, they were already on their way back home. She, as Zhou Wufeng, decided to stop by somewhere on the way, and told the man to wait and not to go anywhere. So it turned out Zhou Wufeng went to a clothing store and bought some things there. Zhou Wufeng said that he needed to buy new clothes because Hu Han's costume raises unnecessary questions. The man agreed with the boy's statement. After the man got dressed, he asked where the contract was. Zhou Wufeng said that it was under the red brick by the garbage can of his house. The man immediately shouted why such an important document should be kept in such a place. However, the man said that it didn't matter anymore and he should pick up the document as soon as possible. It wasn't long before the man was outside his house. The man started looking for where that brick was under the trash can. However, it wasn't long before he noticed a man standing very close by. He asked what Mr. Yu was doing here. As soon as the man noticed Hu Han, his eyes lit up. Despite the tense situation between the main character and the man, the weather was beautiful. Mr. Yu pointed his finger sharply at the rascal and shouted that it was him. The man was extremely surprised by his neighbor's act. Immediately afterward, police ran to the scene. They grabbed the man and twisted his arms behind his back. The police told him not to move while Hu Han only shouted and asked what he was being arrested for. The policeman, with a fierce expression on his face, said not to resist them. This is when the man realized that it was all planned by the protagonist and started looking for him. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng only chuckled at the man's attempts. It was as if the man had an epiphany. He guessed why Zhou Wufeng bought him a new suit and started to shun him. He wanted to prove he wasn't involved. He realized that no one knew they were walking around buried with money because their hands were clean, and he wouldn't be able to drag him off to jail with them. The man was filled with rage. He realized he'd been faking it ever since he'd asked him for money. And at such injustice, the man shouted furiously to let him go. Zhou Wufeng, seeing that there was no longer anything threatening him, was going to go home. At the same time, the man lost consciousness. The police officers pinned him to the ground and tried to prevent him from pulling something. Closing his eyes, Zhou Wufeng sank into his thoughts. He realized that it was time for him to leave. That same night, Zhou Wufeng came home to the children's house. He called everyone to the table and they were already seated around the main character. Zhou Wufeng seriously turned to them and said that everyone would already know tomorrow that Hu Han had been caught red-handed. Zhou Wufeng squinted his eyes and said that he was about to show them something and asked them not to squeal and scream. The whole family did not look at the protagonist in bewilderment. Right after that, Zhou Wufeng took out that very same money sack. He lifted it high above his head, opened it, and dumped everything in the bag onto the table. The younger generation immediately screamed at that amount of money. Zhou Wufeng put a finger to his mouth, hinting to not stop shouting. After that, the main character whispered to them to be quieter. Yuna asked where he got so much money from. She was obviously frightened by such wealth. The protagonist sadly said that this was the money their parents sacrificed for. Afterward, Zhou Wufeng talked about what had actually happened. Zhou Wufeng looked at Yuna and said that she would give all the money to her for safekeeping. If she wanted to spend it on something expensive, she should question her older sister. Zhou Wufeng immediately afterwards asked the children to fulfill his request. He said that if he came back again in his past life and came to ask for money, he should not be given even a finya. Extremely surprised at such a request from the protagonist, but said nothing. Right after that, Zhou Wufeng stood up from the table and said that he had to go and reminded the shadows to forget to hide the money well. However, as Zhou Wufeng was already trying to leave, he was called out by Yuna. Zhou Wufeng turned around to the source of the sound. You with confusion on your face, she asked that it was getting evening, and if he would like to stay for dinner. Zhou Wufeng closed his eyes and thanked for the invitation, but said that he still had a full plate of things to do. He also said that thanks to this money, they would no longer have problems with food. However, Zhou Wufeng immediately remembered what he had forgotten to say. Turning around, he asked the schoolgirl to call him brother again. The girl was very surprised at such a request and blushed at it. She abruptly recalled all those moments when Zhou Wufeng took away the guy's food money without paying attention to them. Zhou Wufeng, after the girl only remained silent, only scratched the back of his head and said that he had to go already. He slammed the door and walked out of the house. The whole family only waved goodbye to him in greeting. Zhou Wufeng exhaled as soon as he stepped out of the house. To his home, he sank into thought. He realized that he had lied to the children and that they were unlikely to meet again. He then went to buy alcohol and stew at a local counter. After he paid, the salesman told him to come home again. Zhou Wufeng waved goodbye and thanked the seller. Zhou Wufeng thought that if he was even a little more late, the store would have already been closed. Smiling faintly, Zhou Wufeng counted how many bottles of high-degree rice wine he had bought and thought that it would be enough for him. After Zhou Wufeng bought everything he needed, he went to his home. Zhou Wufeng started drinking while munching on the wine with an appetizer. It wasn't long before he emptied the shot glass. Whereas Zhou Wufeng didn't expect the wine to be so spicy. With a flushed face, Zhou Wufeng decided to look away. He remembered that his Jiang Xiaoduo always sat on the other side of the couch. Suddenly slamming down on the sofa, Zhou Wufeng banished those thoughts and said goodbye to all his relatives. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng drank the rest of the wine in a volley. Suddenly he had a memory of how he had almost died in that world. Suddenly, however, he also received an unfamiliar memories as people mourned his coffin. It dawned, only soft snoring could be heard. Zhou Wufeng was still lying on that couch where the guy had poured the rest of his drink on. Zhou Wufeng was snoring peacefully without feeling any worries. Unexpectedly, Zhou Wufeng opened his eyes after such a dream. In front of me, that gave off light. Finally opening his eyes fully, Zhou Wufeng realized that he was still in this body. I literally screamed in frustration because he didn't expect to see himself here. Literally jumping out of the couch. He thought he had already been buried in that life. Be you crazy? And he started gaining circles around the table, screaming that he can't go back anymore. The protagonist realized that it was probably useless by now. Shrugging his shoulders, he realized that he couldn't go back. After Zhou Wufeng cleaned himself up, he began to button up his clothes. In front of the mirror, he berated himself for letting her leave. If he'd known he wasn't coming back, he wouldn't have let her do it. Taking the picture with the main character and Jiang Xiaoduo in his hands, the man sank into his thoughts. Squinting his eyes, he realized that if Zhang Zijue could contact Shenyu Zijang, then surely she could contact Jiang Xiaoduo. East Zhou Wufeng realized that he could not return. He suddenly heard a knock on his door. Opening the door, Yuna, Chou Yue, and little Zheng appeared behind her. Zhou Wufeng asked what brings them here. Zhou Wufeng told them to come in because he wanted to make noodles for dinner. Suddenly, Yuna turned to him with a flushed face and said that he could come over for lunch since she had bought some meat. Zhou Wufeng didn't think long and quickly agreed. Immediately afterward, they decided to walk to the children's house. Walking down the street, there was a calm atmosphere in the entire family. Zhou Wufeng and Yuna quietly rejoiced around as Chou Yue watched and rejoiced at what was happening. Little Zheng at this time was happily running around his relatives. Unexpectedly, little Zheng asked if he wanted to stay with them. Zhou Wufeng pondered the boy's suggestion. Stroking his head, Zhou Wufeng told him to be patient because when the month was over, he would be with them. But even then, Yuna approached him and called out to him. And she said that now the whole of Linshui knows about the Huhan incident. She had already said that several of his relatives had been arrested and were also involved in the incident. Looked up, Zhou Wufeng said that he knew that this would happen. We also hope that he will get the death penalty. Chou Yue and little Zheng supported this kind of sentiment of the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng was surprised that a toddler could speak such words, and the whole family walked quietly down the street. At the same time, unknown people came to Zijue's house. Someone shouted her name loudly. Opened the door, the girl asked what was wrong. On the doorstep stood her friends. One of them seemed to be begging for her to help them. Squeezing her hand, she asked if she knew the protagonist and asked her to tell him off, nearly crying. At the same time, a friend of hers came out of Zijue's house and asked what was wrong. The people who came were extremely happy to see him. He told him to calm down and asked him what was wrong. The man started to say that Dahai must already know about the incident with Xiaoshan's father, and said that he himself was also taken to the police. The man also said that if he remembered correctly, Zhou Wufeng is one of the accusers. Dahai asked the counter question of what they were afraid of, since it wasn't their fault. That is, it wasn't their war. The man said it was true, but he was not sure. He said that day they quarreled with the protagonist, when the most Zhou Wufeng said that, Walia from him evidence. The woman was extremely frightened that they were close friends, and what if the police arrested them too? The boys pleaded for Dahai and Zijue to help them. After pondering for a bit, Dahai said that he didn't think Zhou Wufeng had denounced the police and said that they should go around and ask him first. Soon the boys found themselves outside the main character's house. At the same time, the whole family was doing something of their own. Yuna was studying for an exam. Chu Yuyue was dusting, and little Zheng was playing with his toy. Zhou Wufeng, while preparing the food, told the guys to remember to wash their hands before eating. He soon placed many different dishes on the table. After Zhou Wufeng at the table, he asked the little one, "What does the food taste like?" Little Zheng said it was very delicious. Zhou Wufeng especially heard a knock on the door. He told his family to sit down because he would open it. Opening the door, the protagonist saw Dahai on the threshold of the house. In general on the mall, clearly pleased with the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng asked if he passed the smell of food. It wasn't long before all his friends were behind Dahai's back, greeting the protagonist with a friendly hello. Zhou Wufeng was surprised to have such company. Turning away from his friends, he wondered if they had come to invite him to play Dota. After that, Zhou Wufeng told them to pass and asked if they were hungry. Turning to his family, he asked the little one to bring plates and forks for foreign guests. However, the man stopped the protagonist and said that they had recently eaten. Pulled up, the man said they had come to discuss a little misunderstanding with him. Still not letting go of the chicken leg, Zhou Wufeng asked what misunderstanding they were talking about. The man at the same time looked at Dahai as if wanting him to speak for him. Coughing, Dahai asked if Zhou Wufeng had denounced Zhou Wufeng and his friends to the police. The protagonist said he didn't do it, but was just about to do it after the meal. The whole company was pretty freaked out. Suddenly, the girl grabbed Dahai by the shirt. Someone had already started to talk about Zhou Wufeng forgiving them because they really had nothing to do with Hu Han's case, as he felt the force of the woman's pinch and almost cried. During the time that Zhou Wufeng and the others had been talking, sunset had come. As Zhou Wufeng calmly chewed his chicken, the guys prayed for him not to talk at their police. Upon reflection, Zhou Wufeng said that it was indeed fair. The guys almost cried from joy and asked if he really wouldn't denounce them. After Zhou Wufeng exhaled and agreed, the guys almost danced with happiness. Dahai clapped the protagonist on the shoulder and said that he believed he was good and just. At the same time, Yuna was having trouble preparing for the exam. Zhou Wufeng decided to approach her and asked her what she was having trouble with. Putting his hand to his chin, Zhou Wufeng said what Yuna had wrongly decided. Immediately after, the girl conceded, "Not so important, we hero." He said that in such examples, she should use a different formula, did not write it. It wasn't long before he had written an entire solution to the problem. Yuna took the solution to the problem in the elevator, and was extremely surprised by such erudition of the main character. It wasn't long before night fell. Yuna asked if it was about tonight. Okay, the hero said that yes, he would stay since he has to help her with her training. Averting his eyes, Zhou Wufeng thought that he actually had plans to start a business in Zheihai, the people his ex-wife was now living with, thinking that it could wait until Yuna passed her exams. After Zhou Wufeng played with the baby, Yuna came over and asked if Zhou Wufeng would wash his feet, for she had covered the water in the basin. Zhou Wufeng thanked her for her work. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng went to wash his feet. He dipped his feet in warm water. Relaxing, he thought, this is actually a good thing. Crossing his arms, Zhou Wufeng thought that this is exactly what he calls home. Over the next few days, Zhou Wufeng often cooked, helped the schoolgirl, and hung clothes. I mean, things were moving along. It wasn't long before the rain came. It was the very day that the exam was being held. Zhou Wufeng decided to see Yuna off. Standing under the umbrella, she waved goodbye to the protagonist and told him to run home or he would get wet. Suddenly, the protagonist shouted and wished the girl good luck. Yuna started to turn around in embarrassment and told him not to shout because everyone was watching. The protagonist smiled radiantly at his sister. Still waiting for the schoolgirl to run to the building, Zhou Wufeng thought that she had finally gone to take her exams. Getting frustrated, Zhou Wufeng realized that he had to prepare to move to Zheihai. It wasn't long before the rain stopped. Zhou Wufeng decided to stroll down the street in search of something useful. Zhou Wufeng thought that there was still some meat left at home, and he should buy some noodles for dinner. Suddenly, he heard a conversation between two passers-by. They were talking about how the police had found not only buried money, but also money that the relatives had hidden in their homes. While Zhou Wufeng was looking at the zucchini, a man said that the scoundrel had cheated and ruined a lot of people for money, and killing him was simply not enough. The second man agreed that people in high positions who steal from the state should work on plantations. However, The man said they spent it, not out of the money he spent, and wondered what he was saving it for. The second man said that he had no idea. Zhou Wufeng, hearing this fact, was extremely surprised. He got so nervous that he accidentally stung the tank too much. The vendor saw that Zhou Wufeng had spoiled the food and asked why he was spoiling his vegetables. Zhou Wufeng apologized and said that he wanted to buy. Right after that, Zhou Wufeng ran home very quickly. He berated himself for forgetting that things were different here than they were in modern times, because he couldn't just pick up and spend all the money quickly, especially in such a small town. Being very nervous, Zhou Wufeng only thought that if they found out that they hadn't found all the money, they would start to investigate even more. Then he realized that the man would definitely rat him out. Zhou Wufeng realized that even though he had helped the cause greatly, if they had any suspicions, they would not leave him alone. When Zhou Wufeng came home, he told his older sister that she needed to give the money as soon as possible. Turning around, the girl asked what had happened. Zhou Wufeng was out of breath and said that he had not thought of everything and needed to return the money urgently. Zhou Wufeng said not to worry because they couldn't provide for themselves. Pretty soon the main characters were already at the cemetery. Looking around, he made sure no one was there. He immediately ran to the grave of the calm one. Upon examining it, he realized they hadn't dug that grave yet. Zhou Wufeng thought that they didn't know about this place yet, meaning he was saved and exhaled in relief. At the same time, an interrogation was taking place at the police station. The man questioned Hu Han and the details of the relationship of feeling. The director asked the policeman. He said that there was 100,000 yuan missing, and the accused said that Zhou Wufeng stole it and asked what he thought about it. The director was extremely surprised at this assumption, because Zhou Wufeng had helped the case so much, and why would he set himself up like this? The police officer reminded the director that we're talking about hundreds of thousands as well. It wasn't long before sunset came. The police officer said that the defendant's testimony is consistent with reality, because Zhou Wufeng was really with him before he was caught. He also said that the investigation confirmed it all. The policeman turned around and said that Zhou Wufeng was too suspicious, and they would need to call him in for questioning. Immediately afterward, the principal grabbed the policeman's arm. The man asked if he could meet him first. However, the policeman quickly shook off the principal's hand. With fury on his face, he said that if they hadn't been friends for years, he would have suspected him. To the director, he said that this matter should be resolved. It wasn't long before the policeman left the cell. The principal stared at the back of the departing man. The policeman said to keep an eye on the principal, and not to let him out until the protagonist is arrested. Zhou Wufeng thought that he had gotten too excited when he thought he would leave this world. He had almost made a terrible mistake. Luckily, he managed to avoid her. While eating ice cream, he watched the game of Xiangqi. The man checkmated his opponent. Laughing happily, he said that the man didn't watch his horse. Suddenly, police officers rushed to the spot. The protagonist realized without even looking back that they were coming for him. Finishing the ice cream, Zhou Wufeng realized that it was his turn to put up the checkmate. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng found himself in the interrogation room. The policeman directly asked him where the 100,000 was. Zhou Wufeng decided to play dumb and asked what 100,000 he was talking about. The man said he was talking about the 100,000 he blackmailed Hu Han to take from him. Zhou Wufeng asked a counter-question, told Hu Han about it. The policeman slammed on you, said he was the one asking the questions here, and said not to answer a question with a question. Whereas the protagonist spread his hands and said he didn't take anything. The policeman asked why he took Hu Han to his place. Zhou Wufeng said that he wanted to see his evidence. The policeman with a sullen face asked what happened next, and whether Zhou Wufeng had threatened to denounce Zhou Wufeng, and thus he forced him to hand over 100,000 yuan. The denunciation was still going on, and Zhou Wufeng was still there. Shivering with anger, Zhou Wufeng said that he really didn't take anything. The policeman asked if that was really the case. While Zhou Wufeng was confirming, the principal looked at him from the other camera. Folding his hands, the policeman said that Hu Han did not know that he was a wanted man at that moment. He asked why he went with him. Zhou Wufeng said that his parents died because of him. Trembling, the protagonist said he personally wanted to see him arrested. Abruptly standing up from his chair, Zhou Wufeng became extremely angry. The guy's eyes reddened with anger. He yelled that he deserved life sentences and asked to be locked up. The police edge wasn't surprised by the guy's attitude. He tried to reassure the protagonist. The policeman said that Hu Han told him about how he buried 100,000 and then dug it up and gave it to the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng asked incredulously if Hu Han really brought the policeman to dig into his ancestors. At the same time, the principal on the other side of the chamber laughed at this assumption. Putting a finger up, Zhou Wufeng said that he had a couple of doubts. With a calm face, he said that Hu Han claimed that he had been digging, but his clothes were clean. Secondly, he suggested that he might have left some of the money for his son. The policeman pondered the protagonist's assumption. It wasn't long before he was out of his chair. At a sedate pace, he walked out of the interrogation chamber. It wasn't long before the door slammed shut and the protagonist was left in it. With a smile, Zhou Wufeng realized that everything was going according to plan. The policeman turned to his officer and said to check Hu Han's testimony, and said to find out where he went with the protagonist and check. At the same time, the principal was released from detention and was running circles around the police officer. The employee quickly ran to the police officer and said that they had found the 100,000 they were really there. The director was extremely surprised by this and asked if they had actually found it. The officer said yes, exactly 100,000, at the same spot where the defendant said he and the protagonist were. Pretty soon the case was closed. The principal thanked the officer for his help and offered him a cigarette. The policeman refused the cigarette and said there was no need for formality. The director asked if Zhou Wufeng was really free right now. The officer said that of course he was already free. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng and the director were taking a walk after the interrogation. The man asked if the protagonists were hungry. He expressed an offer to go to Goen's restaurant. He also said he would give him a treat as a token of his gratitude. Zhou Wufeng refused and said that maybe sometime next time since his family is worried and he needs to go back. And suddenly he remembered that he wanted to ask him something. The director told him not to worry because he had sent a letter to the relevant authorities, and the reply would arrive in a couple of days. Zhou Wufeng said that he should get the compensation as soon as possible because he had money difficulties. From the clock in the back of Zhou Wufeng's head, he realized that he was also unemployed on top of everything else. And the principal smiled and said that no formalities were necessary, and he would send another letter and send him a reply within a week. He also said, since Zhao Shan is suspended there, he can take his workplace. Thought Daddy Zhou Wufeng realized that he'd rather go to Zhehai after all. The protagonist was thanked for the offer, but he still refused. The director didn't expect this from the protagonist. The man thought that he was only talking, and there how badly he needs a job now takes and refuses. Zhou Wufeng waved his hand at the man and said that he had to go. Pretty soon it was morning. Someone told Maoden to put the rope a little higher. The girl said this height was enough. She was going to play Chinese jump rope. The girl began to chorus to the cheerful game. She bounced nimbly between the ropes. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng approached the culprit of the events. Stopping briefly, he only thought about the fact that this was exactly what Zijui did in his spare time and wondered, oh, how the girl hadn't seen the main character yet and was still having fun chorusing. Suddenly someone called out to her. She turned to the source of the sound. Zhou Wufeng stood there and waved to her in a friendly manner. The girl realized that she had ruined her image. Walking up to the girl, Zhou Wufeng was about to ask for something when the girl asked what the matter was. Zhou Wufeng asked the girl to borrow the phone again. Zijui didn't refuse his request. Walking over to the phone, Zhou Wufeng asked her to dial Jiang Xiaoduo's number. Meanwhile, the girl had sunk into her musings. She recalled her friend telling her not to give Jiang Xiaoduo's number to the protagonist. Zhou Wufeng asked the girl again if she could dial it. The girl shook her head and said she didn't know her phone number. The man only realized how badly she was lying. The man asked if she could dial Shen Zizhan's number. The woman said she wouldn't give it to him either. Zhou Wufeng interjected, meaning she knew her numbers after all, but gathered it to him. The girl clapped her mouth as she realized she had made a mistake. Zhou Wufeng scratched the back of his head and said that he understood her intentions. The whole earlier he was a bastard, however. He had known her for so many years. A saddened Zhou Wufeng said that he only wanted to see her again. The girl hesitated and lowered her eyes to the floor. The protagonist waved and said that he would do it some other time then. The girl looked at the back of the departing protagonist and wondered. A week later, Zhou Wufeng was still at home. Warming up the water, he prepared to cook the meal. Throwing the noodles into a pot-like pot, Zhou Wufeng was already about to cook it. Suddenly, Chen came to his house and said that he had received money for the death of his parents, and the director of personal will bring him in the evening. Zhou Wufeng asked why so more excited than him. Upon approaching the protagonist, the man asked what he was cooking, to which Zhou Wufeng said that he was just cooking noodles. Pretty soon the noodles were ready. Looking at the noodles, Chen asked why the man didn't add an egg since he was so rich. Appeared what the man said. After thinking for a while, Chen said that the principal would bring him 4,000 yuan. The man said he had the right to break an egg to celebrate such a thing. Zhou Wufeng said his aunt's hen had run away. He had nowhere else to get eggs. It wasn't long before the boys got down to the noodles. The man praised the protagonist for making such delicious noodles and told him to call him next time he cooks. Zhou Wufeng said that he's leaving for Zhehai tomorrow. The man was extremely surprised at such news from the protagonist. Pointing his wands at the protagonist, he asked what he was going to do there and if they gave him a job there. Zhou Wufeng spread his hands and said that he was going there himself, because there was nothing to catch here, and so he would go look for something better. By now it was dusk and the boys had dispersed. However, for the protagonist, the day is not over yet. It wasn't long before the principal paid a visit to the protagonist's home, who told him to come through and sit down. The director immediately asked if he was really leaving for Zhehai tomorrow. Zhou Wufeng put this matter aside and prepared tea for the incoming man. The principal asked if he really wanted to slip away without telling him, because he boasted that Chen had already told him everything. Zhou Wufeng said that he was going to tell him as soon as he came. She says the director told him not to lie to him. Now he understands why he turned down the factory job because he found something better. Zhou Wufeng said that he is not going there to work in the evening, is going to open a small business there. The director was extremely surprised to hear this and asked if he really wanted to start his own business. Zhou Wufeng said that he was only exaggerating because he would go to open a small establishment and live off of it. After the principal drank his tea, he put down his mug. It came. She said what Zhou Wufeng is very modest and asked how he guessed and if he had arranged everything. Zhou Wufeng thought that the director had the perfect characteristics for a work partner. The main character's approached "You will open" said to promise him not to tell, then told his plan. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng finished his story. Zhou Wufeng said that it happened like this while the principal looked at the protagonist in surprise. The man realized that the main character had an incredible story, and if he had that chance, he was just lost. After that, the comrades decided to separate. The principal said that if he had any difficulties, he should write to the man. Zhou Wufeng thanked the principal for the suggestion and please have a good journey. As the man was going to his home and Zhou Wufeng looked at his back, Zhou Wufeng exhaled to realize that he had the money, but there was no case left. That is, it was time for him to pack his bags. The protagonist turned around and thought that if he left, who if not him would buy these devices. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng found himself at the children's house. He shouted for Yuna to open the door. After the girl opened the door to the main character, she asked what it was in his hands. Very soon she guessed that it was a color TV set. Zhou Wufeng shiveringly complained about why the color TVs were so heavy at this time, and asked the girl to help him because he was about to drop it. After puffing out his breath and sitting down on a chair, Zhou Wufeng said that he could barely reach it. The girl turned to the protagonist, said she was about to bring water. Immediately afterward, Zhou Wufeng began to explain what had happened. She said that he had been compensated and given a total of 3,980 yuan, and the amount could be recalculated by the girl herself. Zhou Wufeng said as he said, "He's leaving tomorrow." The schoolgirls asked if he was leaving straight for good or not. Zhou Wufeng said that yes, he is leaving for good. He also said that he would collect 500 yuan and leave the rest to the children. Chu Yuyu asked if this amount would really be enough for him since Zhehai is a big city, and the prices there must be higher. Zhou Wufeng patted his sister on the head and said that he had enough. He also said that he would earn money there, not spend it. She also asked where little Zheng was now and if he was still asleep. Yuna said that yes, he was sleeping since he had been playing with him all evening. Cho Yuyi asked if he should wake him up, but the main characters said that he would go to him himself. It wasn't long before the protagonists found themselves at the baby's door. Zhou Wufeng waved to the child and said that they would see each other again. Pretty soon it became morning. The rooster cried out its beginning. Zhou Wufeng was no longer awake at that time. He was checking if he had really taken everything. Grabbing the pictures of the protagonist and Zhang Xiaoduo in his hands, he realized that this picture also needed to be taken. As soon as the protagonist got ready, Nikai walked up to the entrance to the protagonist's house. Zhou Wufeng stepped outside the threshold and saw Chen there as well. The man said he had a bus coming, so he came to give him a ride. Zhou Wufeng said that if they went right now, he would be able to reach by noon and find a place to sleep there, getting on the motorcycle with a smile. Pretty soon the boys were speeding down the highway. Pretty soon they found themselves at the Linchui bus station. The man said goodbye to the protagonist and told him to run to the bus or he would be leaving soon. Zhou Wufeng waved goodbye to Cheng. The man also waved goodbye to the protagonist and wished him good luck. Very soon, Zhou Wufeng found himself in Zhehai. This city was quite different from Linshui, where Zhou Wufeng had spent most of his life. Everything looked much busier. The highway was jammed with cars and buses, indicating that the city was advanced. Looking up, Zhou Wufeng realized that Zhehai was indeed more prosperous than Linshui, and marveled at the beauty of the city. Suddenly, the main characters heard an offer to stay in a hotel. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng found himself outside the Heart to Heart Hotel. The girl who was handing out flyers asked if Zhou Wufeng wanted to stay at this hotel. She handed him the hotel's business card. Zhou Wufeng blushed and asked if it was legal. The woman said there are both official hotel and unofficial ones. Grasping her chest, she said with burning eyes that they had everything they needed. Zhou Wufeng was frightened by such insistence. Waving his hands, Zhou Wufeng thanked the woman, but said that he didn't need it. However, the woman was not going to give up. She grabbed the guy's hand and said that they had clean, cozy rooms leading the protagonist towards the hotel. She, as Zhou Wufeng, was even more frightened. Then I heard the bus talking about the next stop. Turning towards the sound, Zhou Wufeng realized that this was his chance for salvation. Told to wait for the protagonist, he broke free from the woman's grasp and ran towards the bus. The woman tried to stop him and said that she hadn't told him about the prices yet. Once on the bus, Zhou Wufeng decided after looking at the map. While trying to figure out the area, Zhou Wufeng realized that he needed to find an inexpensive accommodation. He realized that otherwise he just wouldn't have time to open a business, he'd run out of money. At the same time, one girl was trying to hail a cab. She said to give her a ride to Jiadian Garden, but only in a cab with the number 411. It wasn't long before the girl was out of the house. The driver said her cab had arrived. Once in the car, the girl, obviously knowing the driver, asked how he would thank her. Shijang said that that girl was cute, but he was already married. The girl said that Zhang Xiaoduo used to be married to the main character and called him an asshole. She also asked if the guy really doesn't like her anymore. The man said how could he not like a woman who responds so well. The man asked if they would pick up Zhang Xiaoduo at the library on the way. The girl said they should do so. Immediately after answering, the man pressed the gas pedal and headed for the library. His car drove quickly in the final direction. It wasn't long before the couple found themselves outside the city libraries. Zhang Xiaoduo was there sorting through her books, immersed in her thoughts. It wasn't long before she was being called out from the other end of the library. She turned toward the voice. Zhang Xiaoduo was extremely surprised by the familiar faces and asked again if it was really them. She said she would be done with work in a moment and asked her to wait a little while. Sighing, the woman realized that her family had set her up on a blind date again, and now here she was. Even her friend was involved. Pretty soon it was 6:30 and the girl had finished her work. At the same time, Zhang Xiaoduo's driver and girlfriend were happily talking about the events. Xizhang kept talking to her friend, laughing merrily. Suddenly he realized that someone was walking towards him. Seeing the man, Xizhang blushed heavily and opened her mouth in surprise. Zhang Xiaoduo stood there. She looked around. Her friend called out to Zhang Xiaoduo and said that she had finally arrived. Xizhang said hello to the girl. She similarly said hello to him in the same friendly manner. Taking her friend by the hand, the girl asked why they shouldn't go to the movies since there were some interesting movies she wanted to see. The friend told Zhang Xiaoduo to sit in front. Pretty soon they were almost there. The friend said that Xizhang would turn around, and they would be near the movie theater. Suddenly, however, the girl noticed a familiar face through the car window. She was very surprised because her buddy was standing there. The friend said to stop the car as soon as possible because Zhu Jun was standing there. After the girl stopped the car, she started shouting her friend's name. Zhu Jun was surprised that someone was calling him. He turned around and was surprised that both Zhang Xiaoduo and Shen Zizhan were here. Shen Zizhan began to explain that if he wasn't busy, then let him go with them since they were going to a movie. Shen Zizhan tried to persuade Zhu Jun to go along with them, opening the door in front of him. Zhu Jun barely agreed, and after that, the door was closed with a slight click. Shen Zizhan started introducing the guy to everyone there. She said that he was her friend and colleague. The driver said hello to the person who entered. Zhu Jun awkwardly said hello back. Whispering in the girl's ear, he said something that he hadn't been paid yet this month, and said he would be paid next month. Xizhang said it was fine. He would pay him, and also asked how much the ticket cost there. However, Zhu Jun was extremely, "You have a boyfriend." Xizhang told him not to be shy because he didn't owe him anything. He would just give him a ride, and also said that he knew how expensive cabs were these days. Zhu Jun seriously said that once he got his paycheck, he would give everyone a treat. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng was trying to find a night's lodging. One developer quoted him a price of 35 yuan per month. The woman was surprised and said that if it was expensive, let him go to the hostel where it cost 50 cents a night. Zhou Wufeng, with his mouth open, said, "Where is it?" Right after Zhou Wufeng found the place, he arrived at the dormitory. The man showed him a room with other residents. Zhou Wufeng realized that he was actually paying for a bed, but the tenants who were there looked sternly at the protagonist. One of them was smoking right on the premises. The concierge said that they collected 50 cents every night. At the same time, Zhou Wufeng asked where he could wash his face. The man told him that there was a wash basin on the left side of the corridor where Zhou Wufeng went. Washing his face, Zhou Wufeng said that although it wouldn't be so far gone here, but he could save a good amount of money. Immediately afterward, he headed back to his bed. However, he suddenly noticed that his bag was missing. He looked around and started asking where his bag was, because he had just hung it up and what had happened while he was washing up. Suddenly, Zhou Wufeng got angry again and realized that someone had stolen it. The man who smoked said to the press he should be careful leaving someday because everything that is erased here will never be found again. We also said that let this be a lesson to him. Zhou Wufeng realized that it was a very smart decision on his part to take the money with him. Not then his in-life immediately ended here. Meanwhile, the protagonist heard a familiar voice. He asked if there was a bed available for him. Zhou Wufeng turned towards the direction of the source of the voice and saw his headman there. They didn't dream of telling each other what they were doing here. Zhou Wufeng started first. He said that he hadn't seen him for a long time, and once they graduated all of high school, they had never met. Zhou Wufeng said that the bed across from him was free today, and said he could sleep on it. Immediately after that, Zhou Wufeng decided to take things apart. Zhou Wufeng said that he did not expect to see Zhu Jun. He should say that her husband seemed to have been given a job after college. The man said that he had been assigned to the tax department, but he would not be given a place in the work dormitory until the middle of next month. Well, look, in his story, Zhou Wufeng said it's no wonder he ended up here. Zhu Jun broached the topic and asked what fate had Zhou Wufeng come to Zhehai. Zhou Wufeng said that he came here to open a business and visit Zhang Xiaoduo. Zhu Jun turned away as he was judging the protagonist in his thoughts. He thought about the fact that all the former classmates already knew what he was doing there was no point in him pretending that he had become a better person. Zhou Wufeng asked why he didn't come to his wedding since he was missed so much. Zhu Jun said that he had business in the family. The hero divvied up the lessons and said that since that was the case, fine. The next day started off beautifully. The atmosphere was very good. Zhou Wufeng bought herself a bun and ventured into the case. At school, he ended up at the Empire of Hope store. Well, Zhou Wufeng decided to start there. Nam thought today would be a good time to look around for potential business while munching on a scone. It wasn't long before the man was inside the building. He decided to consider clothing stores. After that, he realized that although Zhehai was a big enough city, it was still behind the capital. He looked at the clothing counters. He thought that the girl who brother the popular capital only after a while to get here. But despite this demand, hope in this city is not much different from her. Zhou Wufeng realized that this was his chance to make some money. She decided to remember all the trends of those years. Leather jackets, skirts, oversized pants, flared jeans. Exhaling, Zhou Wufeng decided that he would start with the flared jeans. Since they were just starting to gain popularity at this time, he would easily break through to the masses. Zhou Wufeng decided in the evening that he had some time left and watched some more. He remembers that many popular items have their origins in night markets. Very close by, Zhang Xiaoduo was looking at the floor and thought. Zhou Wufeng still hadn't noticed her and was looking around for bait. Suddenly their eyes met each other's. The guy was very surprised that he met a woman here. At that moment, a brilliant idea came to him. Everything became clear to him at once. When the girl was also extremely surprised at the appearance of the guy, Zhou Wufeng quietly called out his ex-wife's name. Immediately afterward, however, he shouted her name joyfully. Approaching the woman, Zhou Wufeng said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The girl sadly said that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time. At the same time, her friends were behind her back when Zhang noticed that the girl was uncomfortable. Zhou Wufeng started to ask if Zhang Xiaoduo was hungry and if they could eat together. Zhang Xiaoduo said that she was full. Zhou Wufeng immediately afterwards asked them to take a walk somewhere because he had something to say. Unexpectedly, Shen Zizhan ran up to the company. She covered Zhang Xiaoduo with her hand and started yelling at the protagonist. She asked why didn't she tell him that now, since Zhang Xiaoduo was no longer his wife, so he had nothing to hide. The woman was still extremely resentful of the protagonist. The guy wore out to get the girl to listen to the protagonist. With a sullen expression on her face, the girl agreed. Zhang Xiaoduo told her friend that she talked to the protagonist briefly. She also said that she wanted to clarify some points with him, but in private. The girl also said not to worry. After that, Zhang Xiaoduo pointed to the side, hinting that that was the right place for them to talk. At the same time, one man was burning with anger. Xu Zhang shouted about Zhang Xiaoduo taking and leaving to go to her ex directly to date him. Shen Zizhan sighed heavily as there was nothing to say. Shen Zizhan said that it was already late. It is time for them to go home. Turning around, she left the company. Zhu Jun followed her. However, the man still hadn't calmed down, his eyes blazing with rage. Finally stepping aside, Zhou Wufeng started talking. By the clock, the back of his head, he said that since they hadn't seen each other, her form had gotten better, and apparently he hadn't been feeding her well. After that, Zhang Xiaoduo called out the name of the main character. She revealed that her family had recently started signing her up for a blind date. She said her mom keeps passing out and she's worried about her health. Lowered his head, she said all she had to do was obey her. In a trembling voice, Zhang Xiaoduo said that maybe this year she would get married. After that, Zhou Wufeng was unable to say anything, only silently looking at the girl. Shortly after, Zhang Xiaoduo turned around. She walked backwards away from the protagonist without saying a word. Zhou Wufeng decided to go back and say something to the girl after all. He called her name and started walking in her direction. At the same time, Zhang Xiaoduo only cried silently, trembling her entire body. Zhou Wufeng decided not to stop her. He only frowned at her back, immersed in his own thoughts. Suddenly, however, he grabbed the girl's arm. The girl shrieked at this surprise because she had not expected such a move on the part of the protagonist. That one hugged Zhang Xiaoduo. The girl blushed at such a move on his part. Suddenly, he kissed her on the mouth. Such a touching action only made the girl cry once more. She was unable to say anything and only blushed. Suddenly called her name. However, the girl was frightened by this sequence of events as well. She opened her eyes wide. After that, she pushed the guy away, unable to tolerate such insolence. Zhou Wufeng staggered and tried to justify his actions. In a serious tone, she told the protagonist not to say anything. Lowering her head, she said that she hated him. She hated him because of how suddenly good he'd been to her, and because of that, she missed him now. On the verge of tears, the girl once again called out and at the main character. She said that in those 2 years he had almost killed her many times. He repeatedly hit her for any reason, even if it was someone else's fault. Zhou Wufeng opened his eyes at Zhang Xiaoduo's words. Zhou Wufeng tried to justify himself to the girl, however. He was unable to do so as the girl interrupted him. She said he was different now, and she wasn't sure of herself. She asked him if he was trying to fool her by being nice to her. Almost crying, she said she didn't understand why he had come here. She also doesn't understand why she met him at the market. Zhou Wufeng said to dry it because she did not understand anything. However, the girl only repeated that she could not hear anything. Screaming at the protagonist, she said she didn't know why he came here, and she didn't want to know. Immediately afterward, she ran in the opposite direction from the protagonist and screamed not to follow her anymore. All he had to do was stare sadly at her back. As the woman ran away, Zhou Wufeng was immersed in his thoughts. Clenching his fist, Zhou Wufeng only wondered if she knew what Zhou Wufeng wanted to tell her. Zhou Wufeng hesitated and looked at the lantern. He realized that even if he told her, he wasn't sure if he wanted to get into conflict with her family again. He mentally told himself to stop hurting her. Lowering his head, Zhou Wufeng realized that he was now living rough in the dormitory and taking care of his sisters. He wondered what he could even give her. Opening the eyes of the hero realized that he needed to earn money for startup capital, but where he could stand to take. The next day, Zhou Wufeng strolled through the alleys of the city. That's where he met the antique dealers. They were all trying to sell things from the past. Unexpectedly, Zhou Wufeng turned her attention to the turquoise ring. Picking it up, Zhou Wufeng began to examine it. The seller said that you should be careful because it was a valuable artifact of the Ming dynasty. The protagonist asked how much this ring is worth, but the seller only said not to even think about it because she is priceless and he will not have enough money. Zhou Wufeng told the boss to take it easy, and once again asked how much he was selling the adventurous jade for. The vendor was clearly surprised that Zhou Wufeng recognized this ring so clearly. The seller said that it was only 2 yuan because the fee was only for the master's work. The protagonist asked how this ring could be so expensive if they were mass-produced. Zhou Wufeng said to look at this edge on the material, and he wanted to already continue, but the salesman stopped him. He dropped the price to 1 yuan and told the man to back off. Soon, Zhou Wufeng sat down on a bench nearby and examined the artifact. After examining it from all sides, Zhou Wufeng was pleased with his purchase. Polishing the ring, Zhou Wufeng said that she looked better now. Right after that, Zhou Wufeng decided to walk to the local cafeteria. Ordering himself some noodles, he started eating his order. And just like that, Zhou Wufeng suddenly heard a voice beside him and turned towards the source. There was a married couple standing there. Zhou Wufeng put down his chopsticks, thus ending the meal. A woman asked her husband, and she wondered what year a particular item was made. The salesman realized that these foreigners spoke the language well and were unlikely to be fooled. The vendor told them to be careful and asked them not to break anything, while the woman pulled a clay item from the table. The woman said it does look like a very historic one, and her husband said to add it to the collection. The man asked how much he was charging for the vase. Waving a fan, the seller said it belonged to his ancestors, and he didn't really want to give it away. The man said he would keep it safe. The seller said he would sell it for 1,000 foreign currencies. The man was about to give the money to the seller when he was stopped by Zhou Wufeng. He began to say in English that he was cheating him. After all, it is a handicraft. If you don't want this garbage, Zhou Wufeng can give it away for free. The married couple looked behind them. Zhou Wufeng stood there, and with a smile on his face, he nodded to them. The man turned back to the salesman and said they had changed their minds about buying it. The seller started to discount the price, saying he'd sell it for 700. The seller, trying not to lose his customers, was willing to sell the vase for 100. Seeing how quickly the price was dropping, the man said that they knew it was a fake. Zhou Wufeng was about to leave when he was stopped. Crossing his arms, Zhou Wufeng heard the couple thanking the protagonist for the warning. Zhou Wufeng spread his hands and said that he was always welcome for his foreign friends. The woman asked where he was from. Zhou Wufeng said that he is a local, just Igor father worked abroad often took with him so he knows English. The man asked how Zhou Wufeng realized that the vase was a fake. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that these vases show traces of paint. Archaeologists have not found the same shape on your vases. He also said that to be clear, he didn't know much about it himself. Immediately afterward, the man asked if it was possible that Zhou Wufeng was also a collector. Zhou Wufeng laughed and said that his father was in the business with similar things, so he knew a little about it. A man with burning eyes asked the protagonist to help them find real antiques. Zhou Wufeng grinned and said that he would be happy to help. The man said his name was Tom and his wife Linda. Zhou Wufeng introduced himself as Dafeng without revealing his real name. After that, the company decided to go through the flea markets. Now the vendors also realized that Zhou Wufeng had brought foreigners with him and were greatly surprised. He beckoned to the main character and told them to come over to look around. Zhou Wufeng said to get the boss some real antiques. Nervous roll there is in his bag, the salesman said he would do it now. After waiting a short time, the man pulled an ancient comb from his bag. The seller said his great-grandmother passed it down to him, and this crest has been passed down several generations. He also said it came directly from the palace. Zhou Wufeng wondered about the quality of this crest. Zhou Wufeng thought that the paint on this crest was obviously not fake, and from the look of it, one could guess that the crest had a long history. Zhou Wufeng realized that although it was unusual, it didn't have any special value, and it was difficult for him to name its real price. Zhou Wufeng started talking to the couple in English. He said that she was valuable. However, don't point at him that they want her, for he was going to lower the price for him. The man said he wasn't particularly impressed because you could find the exact same crest anywhere. Zhou Wufeng said it was historical and a man could keep it for his collection. The seller tried to approach the protagonist, said that this crest has a great history, and it is definitely worth taking it into the collection. Zhou Wufeng approached the seller and asked what minimum price he was willing to offer, and if it went over budget they wouldn't buy it. The seller began to say that he would sell it for 100 foreign currencies, because this thing is really very valuable to him. Because of less, he will not give it away. Zhou Wufeng nodded to the man and said that the deal was done. Immediately, the happy company distanced themselves from the salesman as he watched their backs silently. The seller realized that he could sell for more money. At the same time, the man thanked the protagonist for helping him make such a purchase. He also suggested that the protagonist have lunch together, because that way he could express his gratitude, and asked him not to refuse. The protagonist has his head back in his thoughts that this is the moment he's been waiting for. It wasn't long before they found themselves in a restaurant. The man told the protagonist to look at the menu. The woman told her husband that she really liked this comb. Zhou Wufeng looked at the couple and said that they were very lucky, because he was worth at least 1,000 foreign currencies. The man gave a thumbs up to the protagonist and said he was really lucky to meet him after all and didn't buy the comb for only 100. Zhou Wufeng started rubbing the ring on his finger and said that he was really sorry. The couple immediately noticed the main character's unusual object and asked what it was. Zhou Wufeng said that if the comb was made by a famous needleworker, it would have cost much more. The man said that they had only spent 100 and were already very grateful. Immediately afterward, the man asked the protagonist what that ring on his finger was and what era it was. Zhou Wufeng said that he really didn't know. The man was surprised at this response from the protagonist and asked again if it was really true. The main character said she got it from the village and he can't exactly say what era it's from, but he bought it because it looked beautiful. The man said that since an expert like him couldn't tell, it must be a really good item. He also asked how much he bought it for. Zhou Wufeng said that he bought it for 1,000 yuan. The man also asked the protagonist so he could watch the ring. Immediately after Zhou Wufeng handed it over to the couple, they examined it. The woman was surprised by the beauty of the ring. Zhou Wufeng smilingly said that he planned to wear it for a while once he got tired of selling it. The man said why don't he sell it to them, since Linda really liked it. Zhou Wufeng questioned whether the man really wanted to buy it because even Zhou Wufeng himself was not sure how old he was. The man said that yes, they are indeed willing to buy it because the fact that his wife likes the ring is all that matters. Zhou Wufeng said that since it was such a matter, he would do him a favor. Immediately afterward, the man handed over the money to the protagonist. The woman asked if he would really buy it at the purchase price, and if Zhou Wufeng wanted to make any profit from it. Zhou Wufeng said that he was willing to sell to his girlfriend for just that much because it is important to have friends abroad. He also said that they are friends now. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng returned to the dormitory. When he went to his room, he asked the headman if he was still or if he was reading the paper. Immediately after that, Zhu Jun closed the newspaper and put it aside. Zhou Wufeng asked. Really, he felt sleepy as soon as Zhou Wufeng came in. The machine said that he had to get up for work tomorrow. Zhou Wufeng said he was not keeping him for long and asked what kind of man was with Zhang Xiaoduo yesterday. However, the man was already pretending to be asleep. Averted eyes, the main character thought, here's another man who doesn't think he's right for a woman. Immediately afterward, the protagonist tugged the headman's shoulder and kept calling his name, trying to wake him up. However, the man was not happy about this action. He furiously shouted the name of the protagonist. He started shouting, why does he care who Jiang Xiaoduo was with yesterday, since he had already divorced her, and asked why he was still chasing after her. Zhou Wufeng repeated his question. The man said it was Xu Jiang, the cab driver. Zhou Wufeng was surprised that the person who was trying to date Jiang Xiaoduo was just a simple cab driver. Zhu Jun says that he makes more money in a day than a man makes in a month, and told the protagonist not to even try. Soon, Zhou Wufeng realized that he had found himself on a train. Looking out the window, Zhou Wufeng thought, you're still, and they should definitely be enough to buy a batch of good flap jeans from Guanghai. It wasn't long before the protagonist affected the city's wholesale market. He went there right at night. Looking up at the building, he realized he was on the spot. Still looking at Zhou Wufeng's building, he realized that that one was 3 times bigger than the market in Zhehai. Looking over, Zhou Wufeng tried to understand the situation. All behind the beam, Zhou Wufeng said that he usually goes to the market a little earlier to vomit better. But now it was only 2 in the morning. He decided to lie down for a while, and when he wakes up, he will go shopping right away. Zhou Wufeng told his eyes from the loud screams when they would open after all. Fully opening his eyes, Zhou Wufeng marveled at the crowd that stood outside. Screaming out, Zhou Wufeng realized that so many people had already arrived so early. In his haste, Zhou Wufeng realized that he had to hurry because if he procrastinated, he would have time to sell out everything. Some salesmen stood on a pedestal so he could be seen and said that normally jeans cost 40 yuan and skinny jeans cost 55 yuan. Zhou Wufeng was surprised no jeans because if they were to be converted into a price at the exchange rate of 2020, they would cost 3,000 yuan for 1 pair, and this is not even a brand. But Zhou Wufeng went to the seller and asked that if he bought in bulk 50 pairs of flats, will he give a discount? The man said that if he bought 50, he would be paid 50 yuan for each pair, and if he bought 100, he would be paid 45 yuan each. He also said that if he wanted to buy one, the man should think faster, because the stock was running out. The protagonist wondered if he really only wanted to acquire steam. Zhou Wufeng decided to cheat and call people who want to buy flared jeans with him. Turned side to side, he was inviting people in. Quite soon, a man approached the protagonist and asked about whether they would really buy together and pay together. Zhou Wufeng confirmed this and asked if he wanted to buy flared jeans. Soon another woman approached him and said she wanted a few pairs. Zhou Wufeng asked how many pairs he wanted. He would calculate the amount before collecting the money. Everyone named as many as they needed. A man named 20 pairs, the women 50, and another man said he only needed 5. After counting, Zhou Wufeng realized that there were only 105 pairs, including the main character, and that should be enough. Immediately afterward, the protagonist collected money from 3 people. Zhou Wufeng said that the store ahead of them sold the cheapest good quality jeans. The man said to let the man drive, and the woman said he better not lie. Zhou Wufeng said not to worry, because the vendor had already been approached by many people, and Zhou Wufeng realized that now was the time to hurry up. Immediately after this main character, an idea was born. Raising the money, Zhou Wufeng said that he would buy 105 pairs of skinny flap jeans from him. However, the protagonist waved not simple yuan, but foreign currency. The salesman was very surprised that this kid had so much foreign currency. The salesman told his butt assistant to pack 105 skinny flap jeans for the protagonist and said that he didn't get it wrong, and it was the skinny ones that were needed. After everyone had sorted out their part, the woman said that the protagonist's idea was brilliant. The protagonist said it was all to their advantage. The man said he needed another pair of regular men's flared jeans. The protagonist thought about it, so he propositioned. He looked at his jeans and realized they weren't in the best condition. A lot of the main character realized that maybe he should get himself a pair too. It was already nighttime when Zhou Wufeng returned to Jihai. He approached the real estate salesman and asked him for a good place. He was not very eager to do so. After that, the protagonists handed a cigarette and lit it to the salesman. He once again asked him to give him a good place for the counter. Exhaling cigarette smoke, the man said he would give it a try, and the protagonist should register and pay now. After Zhou Wufeng paid, the man escorted him to the place. Pointing to the spot, Zhou Wufeng said that it was the right place for a counter. Leaving, the man said that the place would clean itself, and the man would go on to work. Zhou Wufeng thanked the salesman for being so generous. It wasn't long before Zhou Wufeng unloaded everything he needed. He exhaled a sigh of relief, for everything was already ready. Standing up in a confident pose, Zhou Wufeng admired how he hung out his jeans. Meanwhile, an important meeting was taking place at another restaurant at the same time. At this time, there were many people gathered around the table. Shen Zijian decided to introduce everyone. She introduced Shi Zhang and said that he was her friend and worked as a cab driver. The man respectfully stood up and said hello to the people. Quite soon, Qian Liang shook his hand and introduced himself. Shen Zijian said that Liang is her former middle school classmate, and recently he moved to Jihai to work for Shinan Equipment Factory. Shi Jiang asked Shen Zijian if she earns more than him. The entire monthly wage in the factory is at least 100 yuan. The girl said that if he continued to tease her, she and Jiang Xiaoduo would leave. Shen Zijian said that she would finish her sentence. She said that she is paying for dinner tonight since this is Liang's first time in Jihai. Shi Jiang said that this is a great idea. Immediately afterward, everyone clapped their hands together before eating. Meanwhile, as dusk fell, more and more people gathered in the streets of the market. Zhou Wufeng stood by his counter and talked about imported flap jeans. He advertised them, saying that they are of high quality, really worth looking at. Nadeau asked the protagonist if he could prove they were imported. The main character started speaking in English and said to pay attention to the material and style. It wasn't long before a multitude of customers gathered around his counter. Zhou Wufeng asked if this size would fit the woman when the woman asked how much it would cost. Zhou Wufeng said it was straight from the factory, and at the lowest price of only 99 yuan. Right after that, the main character's eyes lit up. He said that they also had a special offer. He said that if they changed into those jeans and walked all over the market in them, they would give her back 5 yuan. The woman was surprised at such a generous offer. Zhou Wufeng said that if they thought they weren't suitable after that, after she bought them, he would just refund them. The woman asked if the protagonist had a size S because she wanted to try it on. Zhou Wufeng gave her a pair of jeans in the right size. The girl fairly purchased began to walk through the market. Zhou Wufeng said with a radiant smile that this was the first successful sale, and meanwhile, the company was leaving the restaurant. Shen Zijian said it's not a bad idea to take a walk after eating. Shi Jiang asked if Zhang Xiaoduo liked walking. The girl lowered her head and reluctantly said she liked it. Jia Pei told Shen Zijian and Zhang Xiaoduo that it would be a good idea to go to the night market, because it's funnier there than on the street.